So hello everybody, thank you to be here today. We are not so many, but we will be recorded and we will have the video in internet in the website of the Fondation France-Japon of EHESS, of FFJ-EHESS after the session. So today is the second day of conference. We have the 30th of November conference day focused on the case of Tokyo for Olympic Games and global cities. And today we will have a focus on Paris this morning and on Paris and Los Angeles this afternoon. We have a huge program this morning, and it's why we have not many people in the morning, because the other presenter at the afternoon come from USA, so they are in the middle of the night. It's why we are recording and putting the video in internet after, because it's easiest for many of the people who work on Olympic Games to be connected by podcast and not directly during the session. So this morning we will have a presentation from Hugo Bourbillères, professor at Université Rennes 2, and he will speak about the case of Paris 2024, understanding the social political construction of a protest front in Olympic Games context. Another stake from Paris 2024. He will have a talk of 30 minutes and 15, and we will have time to discuss after of the comparison of other cities in Europe that abandon their candidature for 2024. We will have at 10:30 the presentation of the Dr. Sven Wolfe from the University of Lausanne. He will speak about promises and problems, the legacy of mega event sustainability and geopolitics. At 11:15, we will have a presentation from Dr. Mariko Ikeda from the University of Tsukuba, and she will speak about Olympic Games and the emergence of nighttime economies in the cities of Global North. And at 11:50, we will have a presentation from Florian Purkarthofer. He is a PhD candidate at the University of Wien and in Austria, and he will speak about too warm it may concern, rethinking the question of whose game, whose cities, through sensation, affect, and involvement. And this presentation, I think, will be a good answer to what we spoke last week with Tomoko Tamari about the architects, star architects in the games, and to have another approach of what is architecture in the games. So we will start in 7 minutes to respect and to let the time to other people to join us. And Hugo, you will have the floor at this in 7 minutes. Thank you, and see you in a few minutes. So thank you again to be here. So Hugo, you will have the floor. Just before you, I will present quickly what happened this afternoon, because I only speak of this morning. This afternoon, we will have 4 presentations about Paris and Los Angeles. The first one will be from Naomi Hanakata and Dr. Filippo Bignami from the University of Applied Science and Art of Southern Switzerland. And they will speak about the Thought City project, the Olympics and impacts on urban citizenship, a glimpse of platform urbanization. We will have a second presentation with the professor John Lauerman from the City University of New York, and he will speak about the mega event and gentrification evidence from American cities. So he will speak about failed as well as successful bids in North American cities. After that, I will have a presentation on the question of the scale in Paris 2024, and more precisely of the spatialization of the games in France for before 2024. So it will not be what will say Hugo Bourbillères, but I will try to have something more different and another approach of the games with the national level. And we will finish by a nice presentation from Greg Andranovich and Mathieu Bourbon, 2 professors from the California State University and the University of Utah, and they will speak about Los Angeles to finish this day of scientific intervention with the contestation of Los Angeles. I remember you that we will have a roundtable this evening in Paris, so it will be in hybrid system with YouTube Live, as well as with presence for would want to be in Paris, and we will speak about the Seine-Saint-Denis 2024. So Seine-Saint-Denis is a suburb of Paris where the games will be implemented, and so we will speak about the influence of the games on the suburb of Paris with some stakeholder of the northern suburb of Paris. I think about the mayor of Saint-Denis, the city where the stadium is, the Stéphane Troussel, president of the regional departmental council in north of Paris, and people represented the Caisse des dépôts et des consignations, so the public French group who have investment in the Olympic Village, as well as with Grégoire Koenig, representative of Paris 2024 committee organization. So thank you to be here, and we will have a good day and a long day today about the Olympic Games and global cities. And thank you, Hugo Bourbillères, to be here, professor at University of Rennes. I will let you now the floor and have a good presentation. For those who have a question, do not hesitate to use the chat, or you will have the mic at the end of the presentation of Hugo. Hugo, thank you to be here today, and I let you the floor.
Thank you, Alexandre. It's okay, everyone can see my PowerPoint. Okay. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thanks a lot, Alexandre, and all the Fondation France-Japon from the EHESS for the invitation to speak this morning. So my presentation will last approximately 30 minutes, and I will be pleased after to answer some of your questions. With no further transition, let's start with our subject today. Sporting events are commonly described as particularly conducive to fostering social interactions. Thanks to their festive nature, they are expected to elicit a sense of cohesion or community attachment. But that's what we are going to talk about today. The increasingly systematic rejection by public opinion of candidatures to host major events calls for challenging that idea that these events have inherently positive and beneficial effects for the host territories. For many authors, local populations have nothing to gain from major events, which mostly benefit the economic and political elites. This calls for looking into how these events come to serve as the triggers for mobilization and, by extension, of a form of empowerment. Though, considering the number of studies about economic or touristic impact of such events, there are only very few analyses of the social movement that develop during major events. As the slide shows, it's the second bullet point, you can see. The first draft of research considers the mechanisms involved in failed bids. I think we are going to talk about that today. For instance, some failed bids focus too much on elite sport and elite facilities, which are at a higher risk of being underused. For instance, there are many more reasons we are going to foster later. The second range of studies concerns the understanding of the public opinion construction process in the bidding context, and my presentation will be more in this range of studies. Interestingly, there has been consistently more research these past few years, and in some ways which are discussed further, the 2024 OPGs seems to mark a new stage, both in terms of the scale of the protests and in academic considerations about this form of protest. Let's now consider the case of Paris 2024 in the light of this brief introduction, assuming that the question of the social acceptability, while not being central during the bidding period, as we shall see later, will remain a central issue for the organizing committee in the coming months and years. Before that, let's take a look again in the academic literature, which identify two types of protest during the OPGs. The first one sees the OPGs as a sounding board for numerous political causes with symbols brandished during the event, withdrawn bids or boycotts, reflecting the integration of sporting events in the political and diplomatic strategies of states. The second one refers more precisely to anti-Olympic movements, which have spread around the planet wherever the Olympics are being proposed or held, questioning the benefits and citing the harmful impact of the games. Our study more focused on this type of protest. Generally, these protests are intertwined, but what it is important to clarify here is that none of these are new phenomena. However, two novel dimensions are identified here. It's the second bullet point. The first pertains to how the event is perceived. Since the 1980s, the gradual introduction of the concept of the legacy in the IOC's strategy has forced candidate cities to determine the social acceptability of their project, which makes hosting major events a controversial prospect. The second is the increasingly systematic recourse to referendum, generally demanded by elected officials in the opposition and locally structured citizens group wishing to block the bid. One of the consequences of this is the scarcity of bids that reach the vote from around half a dozen in the beginning of the 21st century to only a very few in recent years. As a result, withdrawals for lack of popular support are becoming more and more systematic. And in this context, this is the question that I just made appear on the slide. In this context, how can we explain the singularity of the no contestation of the Paris 2024 bid in a country where social revendications are, if I'm using some common sense here, usually described as a cultural matter? Initially, the field related to this study concerns 4 cases, the 4 European studies bids for the 2024 Olympic Games. Paris, firstly, which was declared the winning bid without a referendum. Rome, which withdrew its bid after a new mayor took office and municipal policy changed. Hamburg, which pulling out after the population voted against it in the local referendum. And Budapest, who withdrew the bid following economic arguments expressed in a student's petition. For the sake of brevity and the purpose of today's event, my presentation will focus mainly on the Parisian bid, in order to shed light both on conditions and reasons of this no contestation situation. This will be the main part of my presentation. If we have time, in a second part, we're going to discuss this case through a comparative analysis in order to theorize determinants and hindrances of protest movement in OGGC's binding context. It's a work based on a paper I recently published with some colleagues. I mentioned later, sorry. Ultimately, this will serve the main thesis of my speech this morning, which is that despite the victory of Paris 2024 bid, forms of local protest persist and many signals show that it can be a rising stake for Paris 2024. Quick methodological point here, data were collected in documents, website, and social media, and in form of its classic semi-directed interviews with actors involved in the bid and in protest against the bid. These data were complemented by a documentary analysis of national and local press articles, communication materials, opinion polls, candidature files over a period extending from January 2015, which was the beginning of the year when European bids were selected, to September 2017, which is the date of the IOC's Lima session where a candidate was elected. We collected as much information as possible on each event and the study pertaining to its history, the actors involved, and mainly the context of their actions. This study is based on a sociology of social movements. Our entry here is to focus on social movements and seek to understand how these movements mobilize their members through the resource mobilization theory, how these social movements emerge, unfold, and end through the use of a repertoire of actions. We rely on the analysis of a certain number of resources available to these movements. We'll see that later, such as their degree of integration in policy-making networks, their economic power, the intensity of their links with the media sphere, the number of people or organizations mobilized through advocacy coalitions. The notion of repertoire underlines at the same time the specificity of a range of protest actions, their plasticity, which allows them to be interpreted, and their mutability, which makes them evolve according to socio-historical context. In other words, it is everything that people resort to in order to achieve common goals. Ultimately, and I will conclude my introduction and theoretical background with that, we opt for a broad definition of social movement here. It's a continuum between every collective actions to more pressure groups, most structured through the triptych production of arguments, negotiation, contact, and advocacy work. Let's now see the Paris 2024 binding process in a few dates to remember the context and the main steps. That will be brief. In August 2013, it's the first statement for a Paris bid as the 2020 Games are awarded to Tokyo. It's the first opportunity to discuss about the French candidacy in the media. February 2014, it's the statement by the future mayor of Paris, Anne Hidalgo, during her electoral campaign. She voiced serious reservations about hosting the Games. In March and September 2014, in March, it's the launch of feasibility study for Paris 24 by the French sport community. And in September 2014, it's a clear support of the French president, François Hollande, which is from the same political party, by the way, than Anne Hidalgo. In February 2015, Anne Hidalgo changed her mind after receiving the feasibility study, maybe after the declaration of the French president too, and she officially launched the bid herself in June, which is quickly followed by favorable opinion polls. In the beginning of 2016, there are some debates in other cities, but still nothing in Paris. The phase 1 candidature file reports a consensus among political parties. There are no major problems until the Lima conference in September 2017 and the win of the bid. Though there was the emergence of a formal contestation through the creation of the opposition committee, non au JO à Paris 2024, in the early 2017. After the win of the bid, even, the contestation goes on with the creation of new associations such like the Saint-Denis Vigilance Committee or more recently Saccage 2024. We'll talk about them later. Of course, the no contestation that I evoked is a little bit of a speeding ticket insofar it is not a question of a total absence of contestation. It's rather a contestation that it was not able to insert the subject in the public sphere under a controversy angle. That's different. There is a movement created under the impulse of a man, an entrepreneur of contestation, an issue entrepreneur, Frédéric Vial, who has carried this claim. Vial is an activist of the ATTAC Association. ATTAC is the Association for the Taxation of Financial Transaction and Citizen Action. And his movement was based on personal affinities with previous activists, politicians, and academic scholars. He also benefits from an international network based on his previous activist campaign. The movement relied on a classic but quite varied repertoire of action, ranging from petitions and tribunes in media to the production of arguments in book and conferences, which can be summarized to the following maxims: no games of money, concrete, and sponsors. A quick word about the rhetoric of the protest now. Their rhetoric was actually pretty classic, with arguments found in other anti-OPG movements. We can summarize them in 4 arguments. The first one is, what is for us in this bid? Here we talk about privatization of benefits, the socialization of the cost, economic gap here, which is stated by many studies and many scholars for years now. The second argument is, in a real world, is this still reasonable to host the games? It would be an ecological absurdity, to their own words, considering the climate change and the growing concerns about this topic in our societies. Third argument is, seriously, aren't there some expenses that are a little more useful? It's a questionable social utility. Why should we fund an event like that when we can barely provide an efficient school or health system for everyone? Fourth argument is how to support a fundamentally anti-democratic project. Here we talk about the emergency laws, the workers' rights and other social demands. It's a fact that Olympic laws gave the opportunity to transpass the usual democratic process, and it's also a bone of contention. Though, and that's the sense of the last of the verbatim at the bottom of the slide, the critical sport sociology, which gathered and theorized for years all these critics, isn't used in the rhetoric of these activists. Vial explained, for instance, I quote, "It wasn't an interesting axis of mobilization because it was too divisive. We preferred to rely on ecological, democratic, and budgetary issues." Having mentioned the main characteristic of the opposition during the candidacy fight, it is now a matter of analyzing and understanding mechanisms in the immigrants. Sorry.
Yes, we have a problem with one mic, but it's good. You can continue now. Okay.
So we mentioned the main characteristics of the context and the bid. Now it's a matter of analyzing and understanding the mechanisms that will be, in this case, the hindrances of protest, which led to the situation of a candidacy that was ultimately very little contested in public sphere. And the first hindrance identified is a favorable context of the pro-bid coalition. We identify firstly a feeling of revenge for the bidding committee after many failed attempts since 20 years, maybe more, which took shape of a range of speech elements based on the community enrichment and the nation pride that might have reinforced the rhetoric. Symbols were also in the side of the pro-bid coalition. It was 100 years after Paris 1924, which is a very strong symbol which strengthened the Olympic mythology. Thirdly, and maybe more importantly, we identified an indifference feeling which was ultimately read as a form of adhesion. Some verbatims from pro or anti-bid stakeholders illustrate that on the slide. I quote, "It's too far away. We felt a form of indifference marked by questions that were much more rooted in the daily problems of access to sport facilities." Or, "I don't think the local people are too interested here. The proof is that they don't come to the consultation meeting. It's the least of their concerns." Second hindrance identified is the lack of support of the political sphere, in the political sphere. There was a consensus in the French parliament on the issue of the 2024 OPG. This situation did not provide strong political relays in order to spread and support the protest. In France, parties of the opposition, in particular those on the left, like the Communist Party, are historically in favor of the Olympic Games in the name of a humanistic and emancipating sport practices, and it was still the case for this Olympiad. Thus, the rare Parisian elected representatives who carried the way of the protest found themselves very isolated within their own party, as seen with Jacques Bouteau, the mayor of the 2nd district of Paris, from the Green Party, or Daniel Simonet from a left-wing party. Thirdly, this lack of involvement in the political sphere was also reflected in the relatively low profile of the media coverage. Finally, only Frédéric Vial embodied this discourse in the media. But according to him, his systematic invitation on many TV and radio platforms in the summer of 2017 was made at the time when the candidacy was already attributed to Paris. In reality, the subject of Paris 2024 from the angle of controversy has never been a subject in its own right in the media sphere. Here, a possible explanation relies on the really strong pro-OPG coalition. They used pedagogy through elected officials, such as the French President François Hollande, the Mayor of Paris, Anne Hidalgo, former Sports Minister Laura Flessel, through the argumentation of a strong legacy in TV programs without contradictions. Terms of legacy, generally positively connoted, the notion of common project, a progressive vision emphasizing positive and universal values, all of these in a setting constituted by a so-called a political project, finished to create a very strong bloc difficult to face off. In any case, it seems to have influenced public opinion according to many opinion polls and university studies. Finally, here, the organization of large demonstrations of support with the mobilization of national sport personalities, Tony Estanguet, Teddy Riner, for instance, at key moments, ratified the fact that there was no place for opponents. Fragilities in anti-bid coalitions is the fourth hindrance we identified. When we analyzed this anti-bid coalition, their actors and their actions, we immediately considered the lack of critical size to be in the position to face off the pro-bid coalition, which is pretty strong. I just mentioned that. A clear lack of convergence of social movements too. Though there are a lot of activist organizations against the Grand Paris project, which is an ambitious urban project development, which is now merged with some Olympic facilities, but no convergence from these movements during the bid. One explanation beyond the atomization of this movement at this time is quite simple. The contestation started way too late in late 2016, early 2017. Here, Frédéric Vial again explained the presidential election totally crushed us. It wasn't seen as a central issue, especially since it's about the Olympics in 8 years. Nobody thought that this bid was serious. It looked like a running gag. We became aware of the danger just as all the other bids were withdrawing, and it was too late. Favorable context for the pro-bid coalition, lack of support in the political sphere and in the media coverage, real fragilities in anti-bid coalitions. Here are some hindrances that definitely crushed the anti-bid coalition to raise attention during the Paris 2024 bid. Though it didn't mean, according to me, that the question of the social accessibility isn't a question during this Olympiad. By far, it remains and should remain topical insofar as certain arguments relating to an expensive spend of public money, as well as on projects which didn't provide enough social utility, remind us, for example, certain rhetorical elements advanced during the crisis of the Yellow Vest. However, this analysis seems relevant about the bidding period. But today, we identify several registers of contestation in the Paris case, which goes on and leads us to a necessary update. First, a register, there is an opposition register, where activists, organizations such as Non au JO à Paris 2024, we talked about them, more recently Saccage 2024, which clearly reject the Olympic Games. They try to merge various organizations and causes in order to create a cluster of protest. Based on the elements mentioned in the previous section, the aim of the campaign is to obtain the outright withdrawal of the event and to publicize studies highlighting the negative effects of the games. Their statement is political. The second register is vigilance, embodied by the Comité de Vigilance au JO 2024 à Saint-Denis, which is a suburb of Paris. where many Olympic facilities will be implemented. Even if these movements are part of the previous movement, Saccage 2024, on their own, they don't position themselves directly against the event. They want to contribute to ensuring a counterweight concerning decisions that will have an important local impact, notably in terms of urban planning. Céline Gintrac, one of their representatives, explained, I quote, "We are not opposed to the Olympics. We assume that they will take place. We are not trying to cancel them too. We are not going to waste time on this. But we are going to make sure that what happens won't have too many negative consequences for our territory." Their positioning is more depoliticized. For example, the committee lobbied on the outcome for the public inquiry on the Olympic Village. This one would have been, according to them, concluded very quickly, giving rise to a report in a small meeting on March 2018 by using the word of Céline Gintrac, with the very next day the start of the commercialization of the Olympic lands during the largest international real estate exhibition, which took place, by the way, in Paris at the same time. Like a whistleblower, the Vigilance Committee made this operation known and then again requested the organizing committee for a consultation to present their grievances. Thus, in September 2018 was held a public forum of the Olympics, about the Olympics, held by the organizing committee. This device wasn't thought out in consultation with the Vigilance Committee, but rather imposed by the organizing committee in a top-down mode. In this meeting, inhabitants simply received information. In the end, constructive exchanges seemed to be difficult, reflecting a power struggle, but the Vigilance Committee managed themselves to raise attention locally on some layout issue. The third register is an atomized movement, which is rather in the register of concern. It is generally about individual actors of various sport practices implied in the territories who, by an effect of this position, daily engagement in the field, can't decently resolve to be opposed to the biggest sporting event of the world. But they are conscious of the limit which accompany it, and they fear not to be associated to it. The term of frustration emerged from several verbatims and seems to illustrate particularly well this feeling, this fear of not being included in the event. I quote some verbatim here again. The first one, "I hope not to be frustrated in September 2024. I campaign for the Olympics. I want to bring young people for my club. However, if we are not associated, if there is frustration for us, for the young people, it will be terrible." Another very interesting verbatim from a territorial manager of sport public sphere from Paris. I quote, what I feel is double-edged. On one hand, there is enthusiasm because we work with athletes from different disciplines and backgrounds, and everyone is obviously very happy to host the games. But I also feel a great frustration because we are afraid as local sport educators not to be associated with the organization. We were sold the project at the beginning. We had to be important actors of the organization, but the time goes on and we see nothing coming except an annual event. We feel like we're not part of it. On the few events that took place during the bid, it was explained to us that this was not really part of our missions since we are on the local sport. Actually, this is probably where the visions don't coincide. Local sport has a vocation to be integrated into Olympism. It is precisely to bring everyone to sport, and especially the people who do not do sport. By creating a schism in the organization process between OPG and educators, sport educators engaged in daily practices, there is a strong risk to reinforce this frustration feeling mechanism. However, and to conclude about this slide, since the Lima conference in September 2017, OPGs have remained a controversial topic, even if it is very locally rooted initiatives. On one hand, more or less vindictive forms of protest persist. On the other hand, many questions are progressively appearing within the local sports community about fear of not being formally associated with the event of a lifetime. Moreover, several construction and urban development projects are today a bone of contention, like the Media Village in the Parc Georges Valbon, a highway junction in the Pleyel district, or the recent destruction of workers' gardens in Aubervilliers. To sum up this case analysis, finally, the results of the Parisian case here indicates that, contrary to other local political spaces, the bearers of the French anti-OPG protest have failed to aggregate other protest movements. They suffered from a lack of relay from the political and media sphere. Also, this protest, which remained the work of highly educated activists, is struggling to go beyond this closed circle and is coming up against a public opinion that is generally won over by arguments of the organizing committee. At least if we are to believe the last opinion polls, we are strongly in favor of the Paris 2024 Games. Though, and despite the victory of this bid, forms of local protest persist and many signals show that it can be a rising stakes for Paris 2024. Organizing committee will necessarily have to mobilize the population in the years to come, or else the elements of contestation which are real, although not very publicized during the bid, will resurface in increasingly pressing manner. Ultimately, this can be a various danger for the socio-economic legacy of the Games. Let's conclude now about this presentation. Since the OPG are placed under the angle of an ambitious legacy which must benefit everyone, they produce great expectations about economic, social, and environmental stakes. More and more protest movements are focusing their criticism on the application of this approach, transforming opposition to a global sporting event to a much broader critique of a globalized model of society. Here, the bidding period is a very interesting opportunity to highlight conflict within gross coalitions and help promote competing visions for the future of the city. Taking this further, this contest can be seen as part of the social impact of the major event. Bids triggers form of empowerment and even human capital, as it is wrote on the slide. These movements provide opportunities to strengthen individual and collective skills. While OPGs are regularly seen as an anti-democratic process, it can ironically, paradoxically, be argued here that somehow they enhance democratic vitality by creating a new space for expression for a time, even if it is in spite of themselves. The main reason here is intrinsic to the notion of social movement. Social movements are a good way to inscribe a wide variety of issues in the public sphere in a sustainable way, and they are accessible to many actors. So this type of processes are seen everywhere in bidding context, except you'll understand that in Paris. Does this mean that democratic vitality is lacking in France? That's the last question you can see on the bottom of the slide. I will allow myself the luxury of not answering and concluding on this opening remark here, but the question in itself is maybe a bit of an answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Hugo, for this presentation. I'm sorry for what we see. We have some troll in the meeting, so we try to evade them. So thank you. Can you now explain perhaps more time, because we have more time? Can you spend more time about the case of Budapest, Rome, and Hamburg you studied with your colleagues, so Michel Koebel and William Gasparini from the University of Strasbourg? I think you have a huge work on this question, and perhaps you can explain how the case of Paris is different from these three cases, evidently because Paris was successful, but it's not only the same, it's not only the one question. You have also a very different way to contest in the three cities, I think, the games. So can you explain the context in these three cities, and can you make the comparison between Paris, Hamburg, and Rome and Budapest? Thank you, Hugo.
Yes, thank you. I can keep going further, maybe. we have time for that. Thank you. With a comparative analysis to go beyond the Parisian case, because I explained in the beginning, indeed, that Parisian case was part of a study which were more ambitious. So we analyzed the 4 European bids with Michel Kobel and William Gasparini within heterogeneous political spaces with multiple actors, legislative frameworks, temporalities, sport cultures. All of that reflect a complexity that doesn't lend itself to a typological approach. Though the following table I'm going to present sums up the contextual resource analysis of each social movement and gives some interesting insights, I guess, to keep further the thinking of the Parisian case. Here you have the four candidacy, and you have the 4 resources in the top of the slide. These 4 resources, incentivizing and hindering the protests, emerged during the European bids, are jointly built from the fieldwork and the literature. Context and historicity, integration into policy networks, role of social media sphere, and mobilized actors, issue entrepreneurs, and advocacy coalitions. Of course, without going too much into details of the other bid for the sake of brevity here, we can say that all the indicators identified, the resources, seems to us to be relevant for dealing with the vitality and the purpose of social movements in the context of the OPG. About the context and historicity, the first resources you can see on the slide, Hamburg and Rome present both negative legacy from a major urban project which impact minds. They also both present political opportunities through direct democracy or mayor elections, which have had a considerable impact on the withdrawal. In Budapest, it was more complex and nuanced context, as there was a strong hope for international recognition after 5 unsuccessful Olympic bids, but also a very unstable local political climate. Regarding now the integration of the contestation into policy networks, we saw a total integration in Rome, as the withdrawal was in the program of the new elected mayor. In Hamburg, we saw a relative integration because there was a consensus and it was restricted to youth political party at first. Also in Budapest, there was at least at first a consensus in the city council, but the petition's success creates a breach in political system through a referendum question and provided a short-term political gain for the winning coalition. To sum up here, every failed bid had some relays more or less formal into the political sphere. The role of the media sphere was pretty strong in Roma, as protest was held by popular personalities which have numerous followers on social networks and whose words are necessarily relayed in traditional media. It was a weaker role in Germany and Hungary because local newspapers mainly supported the bid and elite sport was the dominant discourse. But we progressively note the key role of social media, which were the main tool of opponent through very impactful campaign. Ultimately, considering the mobilized actors, their numbers and connections, we saw some strong political alliances in all the withdrew bids. In Rome, with the legitimacy won through ballot boxes. In Hamburg, an heterogeneous won from various fields, but with a very strong anchorage in youth movements and other non-Olympia movements linked with Nobleton Olympics and Christopher Dempsey, just like we saw in Budapest. In France, obviously, it wasn't the case. That confirms the relevance of these resources to understand social movements. As we saw in details for the Parisian case, the context was definitely in favor of the pro-bid coalition. There was no integration into policy networks, as there was a political consensus, and a very muted media coverage of the opposition until summer 2017. At least the coalition was pretty weak during the bid, with a lack of reactivity in protest actions. As shown by the comparative analysis, a synthetic reading of the table leads one to think that whatever the intensity of every resources is, their jointly absence prevents to counter the OPG bid. The Paris case characterized by these lacks confirm the relevance of this interpretation. Second key finding we can mention this morning, only the anti-bid coalition's resource seems essential, as both Hamburg and Budapest protest movement did not really benefit from the media sphere nor strong political relays. We haven't time to go deeper in this case. But recent studies on Boston 2024 and more generally on sociology of social movements already enlighten the determining role of the protest movement segregation during the contestation process to play a strong counterpower. Interestingly, most of contexts in anti-bid coalitions tend to be made on an individual basis, drawing on political and militant activist affinities and on existing networks such as the European Social Forum. Third, and maybe the most important key finding, in my opinion, the degree of institutionalization, organization, and integration in policy-making networks is highly depending on the cyclical situation. The subject of the OPG is conducive to political instrumentalization, which is not a big surprise, you can say. Precisely, the support from an existing organization was definitely a condition that significantly increases the chance of success, as already stated by Gamson in 1975. Also, elected politicians seem to consider OPG as beyond ideology, only if they can use them to further their electoral goals. For instance, two political parties, Momentum in Hungary and the Socialist Party, then En Marche in France, with similar positionings, a pro-European social democracy, similar talking points about having moved past the ideological left-right divide, they don't actually share the same position on hosting the OPG. Same observation within parties. If saying yes or no can be a party choice in the five-star movement in Italy, in Momentum, it can also be a bone of contention in the French Green Party in France or in Germany, in the Grünen. In light of this, the appropriation of the OPG by policymakers definitely should be considered as political acts with local and national political consequences in the short term, in case of the withdrawal, or in the long term, in case of the winning bid. Fourth, for both Hamburg and Budapest cases, which were firstly students or youth movements, social media were a virtual space of expression which acted like a catalyst to grow. Tilly and Taro already showed the trivialization of the use of a repertoire of protest, which is adopted with greater frequency by a greater diversity of groups and causes. In this respect, social media allows for an unprecedented diffusion through demarcation strategies and are conducive for networking. They also allow to re-establish balance of power that is always a priori on the side of the growth coalitions. As well about repertoire, it has to be noted that the same tool can have totally distinct effects according to contextual resources again. For instance, the recurring use of the petition did not make it a performative tool, even if sometimes it is in Budapest. It wasn't in France. Once again, it depends on the political opportunity structures and the usually contextual and singular relationship that can grow between all the resources. Fifth, it will be my last point, we can assess the capacity of protest fronts to develop in proportion to the degree to which political structures are open or closed, as already stated by Heisinger in 1973. For instance, basic laws that have been enforced in Germany since the demise of the Nazism introduced federalism, which in turn impacted the consultation of citizens. Direct democracy is promoted locally, but non-existent on the federal level. A national referendum on hosting the OPG in Germany could, however, have had a much more positive outcome for the organizing committee based on the not in my backyard principle. In France, there are also There is also another relation with the referendum and the use of the referendum. Here, I directly, to not talking too much and taking too much of your time this morning, I directly conclude with the perspective. I can develop the limits of our study during the question time if there is a question or if it is your wish. So about the perspective here, and by the way, the first one is also a limit actually, we made no clear distinction in the resource categorization between traditional media sphere and social networks. Though the growing importance of this instrument during our study brings us to emphasize the relevance of an in-depth analysis toward the role of social media in this context. This raised, for instance, the attention to a new form of data collect, like the use of the crawler software on social media, which are highly stimulating, I guess, to understand activism. Another interesting avenue would be to question deeper the fact that anti-OPG coalitions are regularly youth movements at first. It suggests that Olympism is less than ever a universal appeal able to give a common horizon. Lastly, and I'll finish with that, 2024 Olympic bid seems interesting as it provides the emergence of a cross-national opposition. On July 2019, a joint statement in solidarity was signed between several organizations fighting the Olympics worldwide entitled No Olympics Anywhere. This cross-national opposition will certainly continue to develop with the next OPGs, even more regarding the economic crisis that is following the COVID-19 crisis. However, while these protest fronts are structured locally during bidding processes, at this point, there are still no certainties about the capacity of a transnational movement to influence more widely IOC decisions in a global level. Thanks a lot for your attention. Here is the paper which accompanies the second part of my presentation this morning. You'll find over some insight I mentioned today and a little bit more if you're interested in this topic and in this presentation. Again, thanks a lot for the invitation and for your attention this morning.
Thank you, Hugo, for this presentation. Now I can let Felipe Pimenta to have his question. I will open the mic and we have no problem now in the people who are in the room. So thank you, Felipe, to have your question.
First of all, I would like to thank Mr. Hugo for his presentation. It was very, very nice, and which is a topic that I really appreciate. And I couldn't write the name of his article because it was too fast. So if he could show the name of his article again, I would appreciate. And yeah, thank you so much. And then my question, actually I have so many questions popping up in my mind, but I also would like to know if there is any sort of way to monitor the protest during the games themselves. For example, I am Brazilian, and I know that we know that the legacy would be really weak because there are so much corruption, and also even if we were protesting before the games happened, and then there is no way, for example, to talk to the Olympic Committee because they will not exist anymore. And for example, during the games, the Brazilians, in a naive way, they were trying to extinguish the Olympic flame, for example. They did this in a few cases, and I would like to know from Mr. Hugo if he has monitored, for example, in Tokyo or in other Olympic games, if people were protesting during the games, if it's also a way of checking if the local people do agree or not. And thank you again for the presentation. It was really good.
Thanks a lot for your question. I well understand the compliments. Thanks a lot. I'm less good about the understanding of your question, but it's based on my level of English. So I'm going to ask the help to Alexandre.
Oui, pas de souci. Donc, en fait, la question, c'est est-ce que tu avais pu finalement faire cette enquête aussi dans d'autres cas et notamment faire la différence entre la participation des citoyens locaux et celle du réseau international olympique. En fait, comment on fait pour étudier la différence entre la participation locale à ces mouvements et la participation internationale?
Wow.
That's a huge question, but it's
Yes.
a very interesting one.
Yes, that's why it's an interesting one. It's very difficult to answer in a brief answer. Je vais répondre un petit peu en français. Je suis désolé, je vais
Pas de problème, and I will make the translation, Felipe.
En fait, je m'excuse, hein, j'ai pas le français aussi, je suis désolé, mais oui.
Pas de souci, but
Je voulais pas vous poser de soucis. I would like to make like a huge debate. It was just a question for me to express that I really appreciate your presentation, and it can be simple.
Non, il y a aucun problème. Du coup, je vais me permettre de répondre en français. Ce sera un petit peu.
Oui, et moi je traduirai parce qu'il y a Florian dans la salle, donc I will translate for the answer just after.
Et je vais essayer de faire court. Aujourd'hui, la contestation transnationale telle qu'on la dépeint à la fin, je l'ai étudiée de deux manières. La première manière, c'est en travaillant sur les cas en eux-mêmes, parce que les cas en eux-mêmes nous amènent à parler de Christopher Dempsey, de nos Boston Olympics. Pour moi, il y a vraiment eu un virement par rapport à ce qui s'est passé à Hambourg, à Budapest, et ce qui s'est passé de manière formelle à Boston par rapport à la formalisation d'un mouvement et derrière à la diffusion d'argumentaires entre différents endroits. Je crois aussi avec le Brésil, il y a eu des relations assez importantes. Et puis, ce qu'on voit apparaître là de manière encore plus récente, No Olympics Anywhere, ça me semble être d'un autre ordre. C'est peut-être la formalisation concrète de cette passation d'argumentaires et de ces réseaux, en fait. Mais au-delà de ça, moi, je reste très clair. De fait, on est sur des contestations vraiment très, très locales. Voilà. Je pense qu'aujourd'hui, le mode premier de la contestation, si on pense au répertoire d'action et aux activistes en question, ça reste notamment ce que fait le comité de vigilance, de Second Register I mentioned, the Vigilance Register. Je pense que c'est vraiment cette façon de fonctionner parce que aller se confronter au CIO, aller se confronter au jeu de manière générale, on l'a vu à Paris, la coalition pour porter les jeux était tellement forte, tellement structurée, c'est très 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 compliqué. Ça a été aussi bien écrit par beaucoup d'auteurs comme Harry Hiller, comme d'autres qui parleront cet après-midi. Je pense que c'est vraiment au niveau local et en agrégeant. Et c'est ce qu'explique d'ailleurs Christopher Dempsey dans son ouvrage avec Andrew Zimbalist. C'est comme ça qu'ils ont réussi à Boston. Et c'est vraiment ce qu'ils essayent de diffuser via le No-Olympia Movement dans les autres territoires. Pardon, je n'ai pas fait très court en fait, mais en même temps, je pense que tu vois le sens de mon propos. Merci.
Oui, tout à fait. Thank you. And I will translate for Florian, but for the other, we will watch the video after. So what you explain is that there is two different levels of contestation of the games, but you start to work on each of the case you study to understand how the movement of contestation started and was formulated after by the local stakeholder. And you say that the No Olympics movement is a very at another level, international level, transnational level, that is not the same than the local stakeholder who want to contest one local topic or one local project around the games. And you said that finally the local level is certainly the most important because it's too hard to confront the IIT or the International Committee, Olympic Committee, the IOC, sorry, and to contest the Olympism in general movement. So it's too hard to start a confrontation directly with this system. So you say that the local level is the most important and the most influent in terms of contestation of the games. It's what you think. C'était bon. Thank you, Felipe. If I have for my part, perhaps I have a question. I noted it. What is the role quel est le rôle? What is the role of the judiciarization of the contestations? So, because in the case of Paris, there is many contestation who pass through the question of the justice and how you use the justice to cancel, for example, the construction of the village of the media in the northern part of Paris. And this was very very important in the media in France, because not because it's the village of media, but because it was an important decision of the justice to cancel this project. How do you think this judiciarization is a mark of the new contestation of the games? And I was talking with students yesterday about this point, and they say finally the judiciarization is always a way to gentrify the contestation, because not all the residents have access to the judiciarization procedure. So what do you think about that?
That's also an interesting one. I think it's a very important tool in the repertoire of collective action. And paradoxically, I understand what the students explained yesterday, and definitely it's a very interesting insight. Obviously, it's more difficult for atomized citizens to gather themselves and to conduct a judiciarization movement if it's not through an association, if it's not through a structured movement. Though that's paradoxical, because I think it's absolutely necessary to use every tool that movement can't hold, and that's they can't do it without this tool, I guess.
Okay, thank you. If there is another question, do not hesitate to use the chat and the mic. I reopen all the channel. I have perhaps another question in the case of Hamburg. It's perhaps a strange question, but what is the link made by the citizen between the Hamburg candidature, the Munich Games of 1972, and finally the old games of Berlin in 36? So what is the idea of the how can I say, the historicity of the games in Germany? How the population sees the games in the past, and we know what happened with the games in 36 in Berlin, the Nazis game. It is now a question when we speak about the games, or it is really another period of the time of Germany, of the history of Germany?
I guess it's based on there's two levels of answer. The first one is the 36 games is very particular games. We all studied that in history classes, and that's definitely the case for the German people. So that's pretty particular one. I guess there are two manner to think about that, and two main opinion in the German case, even if I'm not the one who conduct the German case. You know, it's my colleague Michel Kobel about our paper. I guess they are the one who think the Olympic Games are definitely some things that can develop industry, that can dynamize Hamburg and the whole region, because the Hamburg candidacy was about that. It was not about only Hamburg, it was about the whole Länders. And that's what the point. The Gross Coalition and the Advocacy Coalition for the OPG used these main argument. And actually, I don't see clearly a singular relationship to the OPG when I analyzed verbatims and stuff like that in Germany than in other cases. It's classical arguments on the anti-OPG movement are about concrete sponsors, money, and pro-bid are for positive outcome and legacy and all of that. So let's make a particular case of the 36 games, and about the more recent one. I think it's more about classical standards.
Okay, thank you. And perhaps now for finishing, if there is no other question, what do you think about the link we have with this contestation of the games since the 2000s and the increasing contestation of the games and the reform of the IOC bidding system we saw in Tokyo? So to remember for the people who are in the room, so the IOC changed the way the cities are elected to have the games in Tokyo. And we pass from a system where you have cities who are candidate and for the games, and the new system is that the IOC contacts the cities they want, they are candidate and selected one. It was the case for Brisbane in Australia that will have the games for 2032. So it was not the traditional bidding system, and the IOC, yes, is in the face kind of a huge crisis of what happened for the new cities, new host cities. So do you think that this contestation have an impact on this IOC system transformation?
Definitely. I think the IOC is in a weaker position than in a few years, and now they had to think. It was the purpose of the Agenda 2020. It was the purpose to think about how to think about the social acceptability of the project. But I also analyze, and it's another range of work I'd like to conduct by analyzing the work of the IOC and their documents, like the Agenda 2020, like candidature files. And you can see in their file that they always mention public opinion like a threat. It's always seen as a threat. Never it's think during bidding processes as something that can develop, enhance the Olympism purpose. So I guess it's the main difficulties and the main part. So definitely the IOC understood that and try to manage to avoid this contestation. I think it's both the contestations and the failed bids. Every referendum for 30 years now are always seen the no one in every referendum proposed about the games. So this is something we know at the IOC. If there is a referendum, that won't be good for us. So they try to diminish the period of de diminuer le moment of où les Jeux Olympiques sont sur la sellette, en fait. Le moment où les Jeux Olympiques sont
contestés.
Même pas, enfin, deviennent des sujets dans l'espace public, en fait.
Okay, you want to say that to make the public agenda about the games less important in time, so to have less time to discuss this topic and to have a mediatization of this topic during the preparation phase and the candidature phase. Okay, thank you for this answer. It was very good presentation. Thank you for this long topic and this long speech. This was a very enlightening for us, and I think we will more understand that now what happened in Paris and the difference with other cities in Europe that contest the games. Perhaps we if there is no other question, we will be and if you have nothing to add, Hugo. No, perhaps
no.
So I propose we will have what never happened in a conference. So we are early, so this is good. Sven, do you have the possibility to start earlier your presentation?
Yeah, for sure. No problem.
Thank you, Sven, to be here. And now, and your image is not a troll, I think. So thank you for this. Emmanuel Macron, very happy to be at the stadium. And you will have a presentation now for 30 minutes. You have 45 minutes with the question. Do not hesitate to spend the time you want for your presentation. And I let you the floor now. Thank you to be here and thank you for your presentation.
Yeah, thank you, Alexandre, and the other organizers. It's a pleasure to be speaking with you about these topics, and I'm sorry that we're not together in person. So I have a lot of time today, which is nice. So thank you for the sort of the wide open page to be able to discuss some of these things. Today, I'm going to be talking about the legacies of sustainability, geopolitics, really just mega events overall. It's a bit of a different presentation for me. Instead of making this original argument, kind of what Hugo was doing, or talking about some results or some paper that I've done, it's more of a status update about our research group at the University of Lausanne, what we've done over the past couple of years, especially this year, and some of the directions that we are going together as a team, and myself as well. So it's sort of more of an overview of our research group. And to that end, this is not a solo project at all, but I have to acknowledge the other people who cannot be here today, but who send their greetings. Martin Mueller is the head of our research group, and I'm sure you've read his stuff. My colleague also, David Ogugishvili, has also contributed greatly to this project, and there's many others, Christopher Gaffney, and I mean, too many people to list here, but we'll get to that. So really what we're doing is sharing some of the work that we've done at Lausanne. So let's get right to it. I'm glad you appreciated the picture of Macron at the beginning. I thought that moment has a lot to say. We all obviously know what mega events are, but in the interests of conceptual clarity, here's the definition that I'm going to be using today. It comes from Martin, of course, that mega events are these ambulatory occasions of fixed duration that attract a large number of visitors. They have large mediated reach, they come with large costs, and they have large impacts on the built environment and the population. The reason why I highlighted the stuff on in red there is because that's my primary concern personally. I work with this material element, looking at the host cities and looking at the impacts on the population, what happens when we host these enormous games. But the definition as a whole really informs the work of the research group, which means that we're trying to take a very holistic view of the sport and the spectacle, but also the urban development. And then I've chosen a very controversial picture here. This is a person who is displaced by Olympic development. What this means really is that I'm trying to include this critical view, not only look at, say, the sport or the spectacle. There's a thing that I would like to add to Martin's definition, which is that sport is inherently political, or rather mega events are inherently political. And at University of Lausanne, what we've been trying to do in our various combined and solo research projects is to be inclusive of all of these dimensions. So we'll start by looking at some of the trends over the last, say, 20 or so years in our burgeoning sub-discipline. There are, of course, a lot of trends of promises whenever you're hosting mega events. These will all be familiar to you, so I can go through them rather quickly, I think. They promise that there will be economic benefits for the host population. There's this kind of restating of a neoliberal trickle-down idea that if we invest into hosting this event, the host population at all levels will benefit. This frequently takes shape in urban development projects, especially after the sort of mythological Barcelona 1992 games, which we'll talk about sort of briefly later. But the idea is to engage the mega event as this urban or regional development project. There is, particularly for so-called developing or emerging nations, there's this idea of this global games, this political idea that you can establish your nation on the global stage, which is very powerful and hard to resist. And of course, for every nation, there's this showcase effect. We get to display our country. We're going to increase tourist flows. We're going to increase investment, and the mega event will come and fix all of the problems that we've got. Obviously, there's a lot of newer literature that says similar things, but I wanted to use older stuff to show how far back these discourses go and that this research has gone. Of course, there's promises. There's also problems. The economic boosts or the economic benefits tend to be overstated, inaccurate, and even if mega events make a lot of money, there's these problems where it's a problem of unequal distribution. So you might make billions of dollars, but who does that exactly go to? Similar inequalities we see in urban development projects. Too often, the beneficiaries of investments into the built environment happen to be those regions and those people who need it least, and the people who need it most tends to be excluded. Employment benefits that are always talked about, this is going to bring jobs. These tend to be short-term and low pay, rather than these promised amazing cornucopia of jobs. And tourism boosts also can be overstated. And finally, hosting mega events tends, unfortunately, to exclude people, especially those who are already excluded. So what we're really talking about, since we're looking at this after the fact, is this magic and fuzzy term, legacy. This is a very contested term, and I think it's time to probably abandon it and be more specific about what we mean. But if we're just bear with me, looking at this promises and problems dichotomy, in literature, we see that promises tend to focus on those three elements: the development, urban and regional development ideas; perception is how outsiders can see our city or can see our country; and feeling, how the host population feels about their own country. And so this is what Jonathan Grix and others, including myself, have written about, called soft power. And one of the arguments that I've made in my work is that a soft power project does not have to be only this, geopolitical international strategy, but also can be directed at the host population, and in order to change one's feelings about one's city or about one's nation. There's a lot of evidence, I think, that mega events are deliberately engaged to on that level of soft power. Looking at problems, I think who's theorized problems the best has been John Horn, who talked about legacy, quote unquote, as tangible and intangible, but also universal and selective. So for me, that means to look at it like a matrix. And the problem with mega events is that the tangible benefits go to a selective portion of the population, and the intangible benefits are universal. So what that means is the intangible feeling, we feel so good about our nation, and that spreads throughout the what Harry Hiller calls the feel-good effect, is very real, and it's very important, it's very powerful, but you cannot feed your family with the feel-good effect. You can't put a roof over your head with it. And instead, the tangible benefits, the money, the investment, that goes to a select group of the population. And we would not be having problems with mega events if the tangible benefits were more universal. And this is this is the kind of issues that we at University of Lausanne and I personally would like to ameliorate. There are some issues with the literature overall. We see a tendency to, within our discipline, or the interdiscipline, whatever you want to call mega event studies, we see a tendency to focus on solo case studies, right? there's a lack of comparative work. I think Hugo has done really a great job in your piece in Sport and Society to take a look at this sort of comparative work of protest and contestation. I think it's extremely interesting. And I think by the time you see the end of my talk, you'll see those areas of overlap that we've got. But in general, there is this lack of comparative work. People tend to focus on one event. Some of the exceptions, Hugo, of course, but Fliedberg, Eva Cassens-Noor, other people would take a look at, like, say, one aspect and look at it over many cities. Martin and Chris did, when we were all at University of Zurich, looked at many aspects of, say, urban development and over many cities. But the problem is that the real comparative work takes it takes too much effort to start up because mega events are so big. We also see a tendency to study mega events and to write about them before the event. So once the event happens, and just afterwards, we work in an industry where publishing happens slowly. You see some work coming out afterwards, and it's very sporadic. London 2012 is an exception to this, and then every now and then, but something about the time limits what we're able to say and when we are able to say it. So that, if I start writing a paper about Athens 2004 right now, people look, is that really the most vital and important argument that you can make in 2021? So what this means is that there's this lack of work over the longer term. And instead what happens is we have these massive investments of billions of dollars and huge disruptions to cities and societies. And then global attention, including scholarly attention, moves on to the next event on the calendar. And on top of that, we also see this focus on the top tier events, the summer games, the winter games, and the men's football World Cup. But there are smaller events that have huge impacts also, and they are almost invisible. So what this really leads to is a problem that we end up having the same discussions again and again. Is it worth it? Is this the best use of our money? Will everything be ready on time? What are the impacts? The real legacy will happen in 5 years or 10 years or 20 years. And you can see some academic and journalistic examples here, from South Korea. Was the cost worth it? Is Japan, is it worth it? Will we make it on time? And then we see the same thing in Paris, we see the same thing in Los Angeles, the same discourses again and again. And this is one of the reasons why I think legacy is this fuzzy and contested term, and why we really need to say exactly what it is that we mean, because I think different people mean different things with it. So we're talking across each other. And this includes, the discussions that I've had with the International Olympic Committee and with protest groups. People are often using the same word with different definitions. So the fundamental question that I'm interested in, and what we're trying to do at University of Lausanne, is to interrupt this cycle of the same discussions again and again, and to try to make it better. And if the same things keep happening, well, what's the first thing that we can do? I mean, we're all trained academics or practitioners, and our step is analysis. So this is what Martin did back in 2015. He identified the mega event syndrome. You've probably seen this paper, but if not, I recommend it. He's identified 7 features that happen in every mega event to greater or lesser degrees. Everyone's overpromising benefits. The costs are always underestimated. The event is taken over by elite interests. The public tends to fund it. They say that it's going to be private, and then it ends up being public. Elites can capture the event for their own ends. The event, as I said, event takeover. The event priorities tend to overwhelm other priorities in the city. There are legal exceptions in order to push through their agenda, and the event is used to solve long-standing issues in local political processes, which is not a great way to run a city. But despite this, people tend to say, but Barcelona, the 1992 Games successfully transformed this ailing post-industrial capital into a tourist wonderland. And I personally have heard the Barcelona model or myth being repeated by organizers in the Russian hinterlands So peripheral Russia, they're saying, well, we can turn, Saransk into Barcelona, and no, you can't. There's a fair amount of literature explaining, in terms of policy mobilities and mutations, why this doesn't work. But nevertheless, this is the cycle that happens. So bids keep happening, problems keep happening, the same literature gaps are happening, and ultimately we've got little knowledge of the actual outcomes. So we made a mega event database with this goal to systematically investigate these claims on legacies, or what I would call impacts, because I think that's a less fuzzy term than legacy. So a mega event impact database. We decided we wanted to make it comprehensive, longitudinal, transversal, systematic, quantitative and qualitative, reflexive, so we're aware of our own biases, and feasible, because it's so hard to do this. We can't be perfect, and we have to admit from the outset that it's better to be done than to be flawless. And of course, over time, in the years that we've been doing this, we've been improving the database and such. But it is a gargantuan, a mammoth, an enormous task. We have looked at every edition of the Summer Games, the Winter Games, the Men's Football World Cup, and the International Expo from 1960 to 2018. We were also, populating 2020-21 for Tokyo. I won't spend too much time talking about this. If you want to see what we've done, it's here. And there, also on the Harvard Dataverse, you can see the variable book. I think we have 181 different variables that we've collected for every single one of those events to the best of our ability, and making it as robust as possible. The first big paper that we had coming out of the database came out earlier this year in Nature Sustainability. And what we did here is using the database to let us make individual assessments of mega events, look at it comparatively over time, and then visualize the data in different ways. And so this, we decided to pose questions about sustainability. We created a sustainability model. What does sustainability mean? Sustainability is like one of those words like legacy. It's very fuzzy. So we defined it along 3 dimensions, ecological, economic, and social dimensions. And we used some of those variables that we collected in the database, 3 variables per dimension, so for a total of 9 variables, and we measured it from 1992 to provisionally Tokyo 2020. And then we plugged in those games. The reason why we started in 1992 is both because of data availability, and also this is when we start seeing the environment becoming that third pillar of Olympism, and Lillehammer is the first green games, and we see this increase in sustainability discourses over time. But when we plugged all of these games into our model, we saw that sustainability itself decreased over time. The IOC has challenged us quite strongly on this. I've been invited to IOC headquarters to have very frank discussions with them a couple of times. They're unhappy with the model that we've used, and that's a fair criticism, because models, we're all scientists, we know this. The model that you use, produces the data in different ways. But we stand behind this model because it's possible to get a perfect score, and it's possible to get a not good score, and we worked on it, quite intensely, and so we stand by it. And unfortunately, it shows that over time, overall, and with each one of these dimensions, despite the increase in sustainability discourses, the games are getting less sustainable over time. This is another way that you can visualize this data. This is looking at it per event. The more colored it is, the better the rating. So when you get 100% score, if you look at Sydney 2000, that yellow is the economic dimension of sustainability, and it gets 100 for long-term viability, for example, and public approval. And we can question the robustness of this model in discussion if you like. But an interesting thing is we ranked this. We thought it would be cute to rank it, in gold, silver medal, and bronze kind of medals. What we found interesting is that Salt Lake City, Albertville, and Barcelona were the most sustainable. and despite that, they don't have much in sustainability discourse. Whereas, Sochi is the worst. And I don't know if you remember, but Sochi was billed as, the games in harmony with nature. I've done a lot of on the ground research in Sochi, and I can tell you that that's not the case. So one of the reasons that this is happening, though, if you look at it, 1992, 2002 are the best, and the more over time it gets, the less sustainable. Why might that be? Well, here's another paper that we've been working on. This one is under review right now, and it should be out, hopefully, sometime early next year. You can find it on the Social Science Research Network, or just approach me for a link, whatever. And the idea is that we started looking beyond just the top tier events, and framing this idea that major events can be linked to modernity. And so you see that there's this period of infancy of events, from 1900 or the 1890s up to about 1950. And then there's this boom period from 1950 to 2000, and now have we reached peak events? Can events get any larger? We think that perhaps not. So again, using the database, these sources in the database, there's government reports, FIFA reports, media, academic literature. We looked from 1964 to 2018 at 43 events, and this is the model that we built based on sports dimensions, media, spectator, marketing, and costs, with a number of variables from the database in each one. And we've determined that for things like the Summer Olympics and the Winter Olympics, and probably for the World Cup as well, we see a downturn in size. So we're hypothesizing that maybe events are going to get smaller from now on. And if they get smaller, then we could see a concomitant increase in sustainability. But we've built a couple of different trajectories there. Anyways, that's still under review. Some other things that I've been doing personally in solo work, there's a project that I presented at Economies that Alexandre, I think, saw, or we participated together in this. This one is called We Come in Peace, You Go in Pieces, and it's about urban development, spatial exclusions, and popular contestation. And this is where my work sort of overlaps a little bit with Hugo. The idea, and I'll move kind of briskly through this. This paper is almost done. I look at 17 events from 98 to 2018, and connecting specifically the urban interventions, the official legitimations, the spatial exclusions that result, and then that last aspect of resistance and protest. So I'm looking at staying with the sort of the big players, the top tier, the Summer Games, the Winter Games, and the Men's Football World Cup. And the idea, exploring all of these 17 events over time, I see there's a tendency to focus on the urban interventions. The most popular ones are roads, public transit, and neighborhood development. And I organize the events, according to which one of these interventions was dominant per event. And I trace that to two different kinds of exclusions. There's the sort of slow exclusion of gentrification and the fast displacement of actual sweeps or cleaning out neighborhoods and areas, and connecting that to this nascent transnational protest movement that Hugo was talking about. Lots of people have done good work on this. Jules Boykoff, of course, John Lauerman, Sonia Gansforth, who was here, but she had to go, unfortunately. But if she's watching the recording, hi, Sonia. There's a bunch of scholars, I guess, and Hugo and I are part of them, who are studying this movement, right? I'm trying to make a connection between these interventions and the exclusions and the resultant contestations. But this project is still in its infancy, I guess. It has taken shape a little bit in a project that I've been looking at, the comparisons between Paris 24 and Los Angeles 28. This is the crisis that Hugo was talking about in the lack of popular support and many different bids that were being withdrawn, I suppose. And this Olympic crisis, you know, in context with the Agenda 2020 and the new norm reforms that we see at the IOC, where this idea is, in their own words, they're reimagining, redesigning, rethinking, and reshaping the organization at the Olympic Games. And in some ways, I think this reform process is quite exciting. They're putting a lot more flexibility to the host cities, and I think that we shouldn't be, you know, universally critical towards those reform processes, because a lot of times, you know, I think that we're going to see some interesting changes in the organization and articulation of the games. But at the same time, as Alexandre was saying in his questions, there's a lack of transparency now in the bidding process, even more lack of transparency. And so there's, you know, there's benefits and promises and problems as always. But here's how, you know, they're promising that Paris will reduce costs by using this transit system, and that LA will reduce its cost by being a no-build Olympics. And I think we can criticize a lot of sort of the discursive basis of those claims, because there's a lot of construction that's happening in LA, but they're not putting it under the sort of rubric of the games. And it's the same thing with Grand Paris. But you know, this has led, of course, to some protests. I was at a protest in Paris before COVID closed everything down. This was at Bourbillères, talking about the, you know, the exclusions of the gardeners, and looking at some of those processes, and looking at this transnational linkage between activists in Olympics LA and some of the individual activists in Paris who are all involved in Saccage and Non-Geo and the Comité de Vigilance and all these different people making these different assemblages. One of the problems that we've seen in protest movements before, like in in Hamburg and in Boston and such, these resistance coalitions, they materialize and then they disappear after their success. And so I think what's interesting now that we can watch with No Olympics LA and this transnational thing, and the Japanese protests that Sonia is working on, is there's this movement to try to anticipate the bids and try to anticipate the problems and to stop them before they start. And we'll see, you know, what ends up happening there. And finally, I've submitted a new project to the Swiss National Science Foundation. We'll see whether it gets funded. But essentially, I'm asking how hosting mega events affect cities and societies over the long term. So to try to fix those problems where we're looking only at the top tier events and we're not really looking at the past. And so I decided to look at both top tier and smaller ones. So the Commonwealth Games and the Euro Football Cup, and looking back at 2002 Salt Lake City and all the way to 2016 Rio de Janeiro. So in work package one, this would be sort of more of a database creation idea, similar to the mega events database or the impacts database that we've done. And then the second work package would be these in-depth cases of these second tier mega events, the Melbourne Commonwealth Games, Austria, Switzerland, Poland, Ukraine, Glasgow, and really making sense of it, both in terms of this notion of urban development or sustainable urban development, and also this geopolitical idea of you know, the why are we hosting? Why would people want to put so much money into hosting this event, and try to understand and pick apart the narratives and the impacts that it has on the population? This theoretical framework is how I would apply that. It is consisted of 5 elements that meant to be applicable to any mega event anywhere, regardless of culture. I've written about this before. I just had a book come out a few weeks ago called More Than Sport, and this framework is introduced there. These 5 elements are governance, narratives, infrastructure, and everyday life. Governance lets you look at politics. The narratives shows the narratives show what are the sort of official legitimations and lets you see maybe what's being left out. The infrastructure is the material interventions and allows certain things to happen and stops certain things from happening. And everyday life, I think, is very important to look at. It grounds all of these grand discourses into, you know, individual the realities of individual life, and all of that is framed in yellow through you know, a focus on the unique national and cultural, political, economic contexts, because of course there's this interplay between these global games and these individual elements, and it's that interplay, you know, that makes what Hugo is calling the singularity, you know, and you have to appreciate that there's elements in common, but then there's something specific. So, you know, the Russian mega event looks like the American mega event in certain ways, but there's also differences. The research questions are pretty basic. I'm looking at the city and the event. I'm looking at the tangible effects and looking at the intangible effects. We do not have to spend any time doing this. It's been half an hour already, but this is essentially what I'm doing with this new project. And within the next months, I'll see whether this has gotten any funding. Anyway, I think I've talked for long enough. Let's open it up for questions. And I'll just say thanks a lot for your attention. And I look forward to speaking with you.
Thank you for this presentation. If there is any question, I see the hand of Felipe Pimenta, but I think it was the end for the last presentation. Perhaps I have now just a question. Oh no, Felipe, you have the talk. Sorry, I give you the, yes.
Thank you. It was not possible to talk. Thank you so much for this brilliant presentation. First of all, Dr. Wolfe, I would like to ask if the framework that you are proposing, it's quite different from the framework proposed by the IOC when they launched the legacy framework back in 2017, because as you mentioned in your presentation, IOC was not that happy with the model that the observatory that you work at proposed. So if by any chance, for example, as a matter of comparison, if you have checked your framework and the IOC one, if there is a huge discrepancy. I don't know if the question is clear or not, but just to compare the framework that you are working on and the one proposed by the IOC.
Yeah, that's a great question, Felipe. Thank you. Yeah, of course. So I think I like working with the IOC. I have to admit that I enjoy that aspect of this job because they're very smart and they're very friendly and they're very willing to discuss with researchers, and not every mega event owner is that way. You know, they're not as transparent as IOC, and so I think it's necessary to sort of give credit where credit is due, but it's a challenge to do that because they have an agenda to their work. Fundamentally, their goals are not necessarily in alignment with my goals. My goal is to be a researcher and to understand what's happening and how we can make it better. And there is a fundamental tension in IOC. I've been talking to sustainability and legacy groups, Legacy, and you know, these people are trying to do good work, but can you do good work in terms of making a more sustainable, less damaging mega event when there are so many billions of dollars on the line? And so what we're really asking fundamentally is, can you go against the profit motive? And unfortunately, looking at the history of mega events and just sort of human development and modernity overall, people don't often win against, you know, the profit motive, and that's just how it is. And you even see those battles within IOC. I don't think that people at IOC are, you know, villains as some people would portray them, especially in you know, protest communities. But I think it's fair that the protest communities feel that because they're coming from a different position. But you know, working, you know, with IOC or you know, talking with them, I see there are internal battles. It's a heterogeneous group in there, and they are fighting their own. They're fighting their own battles. They want many different things. There are many different people within this institution. So that's a long way of getting to your question about the framework. IOC's framework is going to measure what makes IOC and the Olympics look good. Just fundamentally, there is a political imperative there that even if you try as hard as you can to be neutral, it's not really their job to be neutral, and it can't be. Which is why the Olympic Games indicators was such an interesting project, because it doesn't necessarily provide as accurate, I think, of a picture as we do in the sort of research community. And that's difficult. That's a difficult position for us to be in, because I'm trying to be inclusive of all of these different diversities of viewpoints, even if my heart politically leans one way or another. I happen to love the games, I happen to hate what they do to cities, but I'm trying not to let that color the model that I build. If I want to, I can just study protest movements and be an activist and just say, look how terrible these games are. Or I could be one of those scholars who's just talking about what great things the games do for cities. But I don't think either of those are necessarily fair, and that's not what I'm trying to do. So the framework that I'm putting forward with those 5 elements is a way to try to encapsulate the totality as best as I can, right? So framed within a host city's context, their economy, their government, their culture is different. There are protesting cultures, there's non-protesting cultures. Brazil loves to protest, Russia does not. Those are differences. And then look at the narratives. What are the organizers saying? What are the event owners saying? What are the local organizers saying? Fundamentally, who speaks for the city? And then what do people say? What is the actual life, everyday life on the ground? What is happening with that? What changes to the city are we actually witnessing as compared to what is being said? And so that's I think the difference. I'm working without the profit motive and to try to be sort of like inclusive, if that answers your question.
Absolutely. Thank you for your answer. And now, Hugo Bourbillères, you have the talk.
Yeah, thank you, Sven, for your presentation. I agree with Sven about how open the IOC is with researchers, and we have to give them that credit clearly. And it's always interesting to talk with them. They are very proactive, and you really have to keep a nuanced approach when you talk about a critical approach about their work. I applied this statement to myself when I spoke earlier. And we need to clearly make a distinction between a fact judgment and value judgment. And that's the difficult position of researcher. My question for you, Sven, is about your first part of your presentation and the paper you presented. And I'm going to read it as soon as possible. I didn't do it. I found your work on the database very stimulating from a methodological point of view. It raises very complicated questions about the comparison of legacies. With colleagues from the University of Paris-Saclay, we worked on the social impact of Economies, and in a literature review we pointed out a form of consensus in the literature around the need to develop a methodology to analyze impacts on the social aspect according to the characteristics of the host territory, the singularities of the sport activities, political will, etc., which necessarily puts a distance with any possibility of comparison with regard to this complexity, which seems non-reducible. How do you manage this limit in your work? And I have a second question, which is also the same, and then I stop talking. The same question about the formalization of the graphs. How do you move from qualitative analysis of a deeply immaterial dimension to graphical representation, which presupposes, I guess, a quantitative measurement of the dimension? On our side, clearly, we had considered that this limit was unsurpassable. But I know this is a very whole debate that we'll not settle today. But how do you manage that and address this limit in your work? Thank you.
Great question. C'était super. Yeah, I mean, excellent. So what I would say is definitely take a look at the mega event database paper, and please criticize it. That's how we get better. And this paper also. So I won't spend too much time talking about the methodology, but really the philosophy of knowledge is what you're talking about here. So here's what we've done, right? First, you're right. There's a difficulty in comparing these events, which are so enormous that how can they? I think that's one of the reasons why we see so many solo cases in the literature, is because a comparison is not just practically difficult, but in terms of like an actual application of fair science, it's really challenging to make an honest, legible, robust comparison. So one reason why we created all of these variables, 181 or 86 or something like that, it's in the mega events database paper, and again on the Harvard Dataverse. I can send out links if you wish. We decided how we started it was basically a team meeting over coffee, and discussing what do we look at in mega events. All of us are specialists in different ways. Where we can look at the costs, we can look at basic sporting events, sporting features, the number of athletes. Yeah. And so, that remains consistent regardless of the city. There are always going to be athletes. There's always going to be journalists. There's always going to be venues. Okay. And there's costs associated to that. And so we can measure those costs. Yeah. And then we have to balance them. Okay. So let's deflate them, because, if we're looking at Rome 1960, versus 2018, that's so we have to convert the costs into, we decided to do it into US dollars 2018, and so there's this huge conversion process of every cost and a deflation table, and it was a colossal amount of work for every fund that we found, to say nothing of the fact that we often find contradictory data. A media report says one thing, a scholar says another thing, and the final report says a third thing. So we have to make these judgments about which is the one that we're going to use, and we have to make that consistent across every one of these events, across every one of these variables. And if we make one change, that change has to cascade through everything. This is why it's been several years to do this and to make legible comparisons. But we don't want to only be quantitative, we also want to be qualitative. And so, what have we seen? Is there, are there news reports? Are there academic reports? Are there firsthand accounts of, what has happened, where, and what aspects of the city that we're looking at? And so we establish all of these variables, and then we let them grow over time in this kind of an inductive process, almost like grounded theory, where we created these variables, and then we tried to work with them, and then we refined them until we finally got this variable book that we have then. And then we decided to populate that, and we populated it ourselves, starting with our own knowledge. Chris Gaffney did, and Gabriel Silvestre did the collection work on Brazil. And on Mexico, because they speak Spanish and Portuguese. I did collection on Russia because I speak Russian. We all sort of shared the job in French, and you have an Italian person and this and that, and then had to go out for contractors, more and more contractors, to do things in Korea and Japan and such. But essentially, Hugo, what we're really talking about is flattening reality. We have to make some sacrifices, because the totality of the event, in order to be discussed and compared, we have to flatten it. And flattening it makes us lose things. So we flattened all of the events into this big quantitative and qualitative thing. So there's one process of flattening. And then for this paper that you see on the screen here, we assigned numerical values to those 9 indicators or those 9 variables that became our 3 indicators for economic, ecological, and social sustainability. And so, we define all of those in the paper. and why we came, why we chose them, how we assigned them, numbers, was also another process of flattening reality. And what I alluded to this in the talk, but I can spend another minute talking about it now. What we really tried to do is make it possible for in our model for an event to score 100. We wanted it to be possible. We're not, trying to be intentionally negative with the model. We're saying, it is possible to get a perfect score in sustainability, and it is possible to get 0. And we're, pretty happy with these grades. Unfortunately, none of the events got into the so-called green zone, scoring over a 75, but they got, close. You can tweak the model, you can change the model and get different results. And that really gets down to a pretty esoteric, but very important idea about knowledge creation. At what level are you producing knowledge? This sort of epistemological and ontological debates about what knowledge is. So yeah, you're absolutely right to hone in on these difficulties. And yeah, you're right. From certain respects, I think comparisons are impossible. But it's also important, I think, to understand those sacrifices and to be transparent about those sacrifices in order to make this kind of comparison happen. Because otherwise, what happens is we risk just restating these problems where, these events move around the world. They're not sustainable. What does that mean? They damage the global environment, the local environment, the host city, the host society, and a few people make a lot of money and then they move on to another thing. And that's a problem that can't continue. So what we're trying to do is interrupt that process by showing it in context, even though it's got some sacrifices to it. That was a very long answer, but it was a very, very good series of questions.
Yes, thank you. I will now let Florian Purkarthofer have a question, and I will ask to Sven to have a short question. And in 2 minutes, we will let Mariko Ikeda to have his presentation. Thank you.
Oh, okay. So short question, short answer maybe. I was very fascinated by a talk and I liked it a lot, and I see some parallels here. So there is this on 3 stages. So on one stage, there is this globalization of like the organization of sport mega events and also other mega events. On the second stage, there is the globalization of the protest against these mega events. And on the third stage, like you are, there is the globalization of research on both of these things. And I think that we are coming into a very interesting process here, where we are trying to understand more of like universal or global rules, even though you said there is some flattening. But I think that what's interesting here is that like, I'm not sure who is following whom more or less, but I would like to hear your take on it, even though it's just a few minutes time, like this globalization of like these all modes of like mega event circle.
Let me ask for a quick clarification, and then I will try very hard to keep short. Alexandre knows me already. I will never take a shortcut if there's a longer one available. So Florian, what you're asking, I think if I hear you correctly, but please correct me if I missed it, is this idea of globalization of mega events and globalization of the research community and the relations between those? Is that what you're saying?
Yes, and also the third part, like the globalization of the counter movement to these mega events.
Right.
So right. I think that it's very fruitful, but it's also quite interesting that like these contrasting players use the same strategy.
Yeah, that is a very interesting question indeed. It's quite uncomfortable, honestly, in my position sometimes to think about this, because in a way I'm profiting off of mega events in the same way that some global consultancy firm is. It's just that my business happens to be, critiquing them from the academy. But, here I am many years working on this, I mean, I did my PhD on it, and yeah, I'm still working on mega events. And so I'm little different from, you know, somebody working for a KPMG or some. I mean, my salary is quite a bit lower, but still, I am a beneficiary of this giant money-making machine. I think the transnational protest aspect is really interesting, especially as they're trying to create legacy structures for protests. So like if you go to the No Olympics LA website or any of their meetings, they're quite clear about their desire to create some sort of like a repository or a database or a transnational resistance movement. And so you see this parallel growth. So in the same way that that there will be learning in between mega events, you know, and so you within in FIFA, the World Cup, right? You have these the knowledge transfer departments within FIFA, where I was able to, you know, do a little bit of observation several years ago. You know, you have the World Cup going on, and then you've got people coming from the next event and doing this knowledge exchange, and we see a mirrored version of that with you know, in Japan, Hangaren no Kai and the Paris organizers and the LA organizers, and they're doing this kind of knowledge transfer thing. And what's really interesting is to see the ways in which knowledge transfer fails at the mega event organizer side because of policy mutations and mobilities, and wondering, does that same process of failure, will that happen also in protest movements? I think that's a thing for a great, that's a great research topic, and we should, you know, discuss it at length. Now is not the time. I'm going to stop. I'm getting this like very insistent look from Alexandre being like, Ale, thank you for listening to me for so long, everyone. Let's talk more.
Thank you for this very nice talk, and it was very exciting. And I think we have many things to discuss in the near future. Mariko, Ikeda, have you the possibility to put your PowerPoint now?
Yes, I'm going to. Yes, thank you.
Yes. Thank you to be here today, and I know this is late in evening in Japan now. Thank you to be with us, and I will let you now the talk. I remember that you have 35 minutes for your presentation and to have some questions. So you have time in front of you. Do not hesitate to spend time for your presentation, and thank you to be here today.
Thank you so much. Good evening, all of you. As I have just been introduced, my name is Ikeda, and I'm currently engaging with Faculty of Art and Design. So my specific interest is lying in the art and design and artists and existence of the artwork and so on. And now I'd like to move on to the presentations. So this will be the outline of this, the very rough outline of my presentation. And first, I will describe the perspectives relating to this presentation. And in the next step in chapter 2, I will discuss the rise of the nighttime economies in the host cities of the Olympic Games since the 1990s, by noting how the host cities have developed their nighttime activities. And in the third part, the very last part, I will describe about the nighttime economies and relating practices in Japan and Tokyo as an example. Now, I will begin with the questions posed in this symposium, namely, why is the Olympic Games, or shortly Olympics, oriented towards global cities? In large cities that have experienced deindustrialization, the importance of the service sector in general and also urban tourism relating to this service sector are both increasing. And mega events such as Olympics are the most effective medium for promoting a city as a tourist destination with a popularity to the whole world. And this may be one general answer for the pre-mentioned question. At the same time, it has been noted that particularly in European countries, that real estate capital has been invested in accommodation, especially the accommodated buildings, for inbound tourism from and outside of the EU countries, especially since the 2010s, which is an important trend in conjunction with the development of the Athletes' Village and its subsequent development plan for sale. And I have picked several examples, but one example is the Ryuro Share Hotel, this one, and located in the harbor area of Kotoku, which is the eastern part of Tokyo. And this has been converted into the accommodation facility, which has been opened in 2017. And the original offices has been used as an office building completed in 1988. So in terms of the heritage, it has no values at all to use or to find the historical meanings at all. But anyway, the accommodation under certain corporations such as the Liberta Corporations, which is a real estate company affiliated to KO Railways, made such investments onto renovation project in Eastern Tokyo, especially in the late 2010s. So obviously here we could see that for Olympic Games 2020, and especially 5 years prior to the Olympic Games, and the investment has been accelerated, especially in this way, you know. So by renovations or by foreseeing the certain role of the renovation as an investment, then I can slightly see that such kind of renovation project has been seen, but especially in the tourism industry in general. Now, relatedly, a global city has been defined as a city that can be known for capital flows by a well-known economic researcher who is Saskia Sassen. And in fact, the role of tourism as a service industry is a major factor behind the hosting of the Olympic Games in a global city in the 2010s. And in particular, there is an overlap between the host city of Olympic Games and the top ranking cities of the world, which are rated or which have been rated by the certain agencies that have been used as a reference by the relevant scholars, and the Olympics may be an option in terms of attracting economic investment. And this table is showing that the city rankings by various agency ratings and cities hosting mega events in 2013 and 2015. And surprisingly, this table is actually quoted from the Tokyo Metropolitan Government's Bureau of Urban Development. So City of Tokyo is recognizing that this kind of ranking is quite important for them to maintain their identity in the global cities context as well. And from this, we can also understand that how cities in 2010s are aware of other cities and how Olympic Games are linked to such inter-city competition in general. Now, another perspective there is about the opposite flow. So how Olympic Games or Olympics give transformation on global cities in the physical form, but also in the psychological form as well. And taking Tokyo as an example, the construction and also reconstructions of the Yoyogi Stadium and the development plan or development of urban infrastructure are some of the most obvious changes that have occurred as a result of the Olympics. In the 1960s, Tokyo was still under American occupation, and especially the Yoyogi Park, where there were Japanese army facilities ahead of during the Second World War, was also acquisitions, or the property itself has been acquisition by the US Army and USA, and it has been used as a residential area for American troops. And the property of Yoyogi Park was also returned to the Tokyo Metropolitan Government for holding the Olympic Games in 1964. Also, in the 1960s, Tokyo was in the midst of a period of rapid economic growth, and the city's urban environment was rapidly losing its river culture, which could be originated in the Edo period onwards. For this reason, a large-scale construction work has been carried out, including the urban structure like this. So this is a Tokyo Metropolitan Highway, and that has been prepared only for 2 years prior to the Tokyo Olympic Games in 2064. So therefore, you know, the riverside organizes spaces onto the river has been used because the property is belonging to the nation and Japanese government. But at the same time, you can see that how the water culture and waterfront development has been prevented from these constructions of the highway as well. And for this reason, large-scale construction work has been carried out to improve the hydrophilic nature of the Shibuya River in preparation for 2020, and mainly which was held by a very private investor such as the Tokyo Railway Corporation. However, those, let's say, the material changes often happens quite often in Japan. The reason for this is that Japan is prone to the natural disasters you may be familiar with, and as a kind of the wood cultures, you know, like buildings, so many buildings are made of wood, and buildings and other hardware as well have always been renewed by a myriad of actors, not only for the Olympic Games, but regularly we are confronting with certain transformations of the physical fabrics in general. And this is why the essence of the Japan's so-called heritage is lying in more intangible side, and transformation in the intangible would be also, its role might be a huge. And for instance, in order to welcome visitors from abroad, in 1964, Tokyo organized a campaign to beautify the urban spaces by collecting rubbish on the streets and also raising awareness of the public health, etc. And in the run-up to 2020, for example, also the smoking in public space became to be prohibited, you know, by the regulations of the town. Other initiatives, including the abolition of the Tokyo place names in 1964, which had been in use since the Edo period. So many town names has been erased and displaced by a very new geographical name since the Tokyo Olympic Games as well. And the implementation of the English language education. And also you can see here that the certain linguistic landscape has been obviously changed by using a certain symbols for make it more accessible to all language users in general, and to support international visitors in 2020. Also, the increase in health awareness of the population as a whole, and also the kind of sports management and improvement of the sports as an activity has been also developed as well. And also the development of the security companies such as Sekomu or ALSOC has been found for the Olympic Games, with the very first Olympic Games in 1964. And not only the technologies in the securities, but also in the media sectors have been changed and transformed and also very much improved. So let's say that the kind of this impact on these is more lying into the intangible aspects as well. Now, in other words, academic discussions tends to be on emphasis on the relationship between the Olympics and the city, or the city's hard, let's say, the physical impact. And that has been too much focused mainly on the material aspects shown in yellow, such as changes in the built environment due to redevelopment plans and urban planning on environment impacts. However, the impact of the Olympics also extends to non-material aspects such as cultures and laws and people's behaviors and norms, as well as the lifestyles of the Japanese people as well. So the promotion of the nighttime economies and nightlife tourism can be also counted or understood as this kind of the changes, both in hardware and software, and the policies and laws relating to the nighttime, which is this non-administrative time. So the night is especially, you know, could be understood as a very non-administrative time, but it is inseparable. So that the aim of this presentation is to provide just a very rough but overview of the relationship between Olympic host cities in the global north especially, and the nighttime economies since the 2010s, and to examine what Japan's and Tokyo's nighttime economy policy has aimed to achieve, comparing it with the policies of European cities and countries. And please note that some of the content of this presentation may have been presented in previous publications, such as the following stated. Okay, now Firstly, an overview of the changes that have taken place at night in global cities that has hosted the Olympics since 1990s. And Barcelona, which hosted the 1992 Olympic Games, was one of the very first cities to develop tourism on the waterfront area. But the impact of the tourism led to an increase in nighttime traffic and neighborhood problems from 2000s onwards. So such kind of residential areas gentrification is also getting to be more problematic in 2000s onwards in Barcelona especially. And neighborhood problems have been more apparent. And for this reason, one specific program called Bona Nit Barcelona program has been launched to create opportunities for creating a dialogue in between the resident and also the certain actors relating to the nighttime industries. And the city has also set up night offices in the city hall as well. And the different cases from the Sydney is that Sydney has hosted the 2000s Olympic Games and started night bus services already at the end of the 1980s in response to the deregulations of the recall laws in the late 1980s and the need to revitalize the city centers such as the UK cities does. And during the Olympic Games, the city also has launched bus services that goes around the city center, but it has been ended 2 years later, so 2002, and it has been ended up. But generally speaking, you know, the city of the Sydney is also promoting engaging with the promotions of the nighttime industries, and they have also done a pilot survey as well, and late night management areas research in which was conducted in 2010 and 2012 is shown here. Now, to support this increase in mobility, nighttime public transport services are perhaps the most very obvious change in global cities. And after hosting the 2012 Olympic Games, London went on to host the Rugby World Cup as well as a very similar and mega event. And the following year, in 2016, the city has been also launched the night tube and began operating 24-hour tube services, especially at the weekends. And here is a table 1, and which is only written in Japanese, and I have not yet translated into English, sorry. But it is indicating that the New York, Chicago, Stockholm, Berlin, and Copenhagen, and London, and that is only the weekends and 24 hours, and every city has been launched already as a night tubes and related services as well. And in the host cities of the Olympics, 2000 saw the emergence of the nighttime issues such as the noise problem in the residential areas and alcohol-related antisocial behavior as well. And in order to resolve these local conflicts, governance during the nighttime by a certain organization such as the Amsterdam's Night Mayors, or actually the Berlin's Club Commission was the very first institution that has begun such engagement. But anyway, these organizations who are operating and also creating the nighttime governance became increasingly important in the global cities. In contrast, in the 2010s, the economic potential of nightlife culture as a resource for urban tourism and creativities, or the cultural or promotion of the cultural and creative industries was recognized by the city, and regulations were revised or partially abolished, and the statistic on the nighttime or nightlife cultural economies in general began to be developed. This has led to the review and abolition of various regulations as well, and the development of the statistics of the cultural economies in general. And Paris, which will host the Olympic Games in 2024, is also no exceptions for the nighttime promotion. It has the city of Paris has already recognized the cultural potential of the night with the Fête de la Musique and the Nuit Blanche, and has experienced of running the metro nightly in conjunction with these events as well. And in 2010, under the directions of the DACT, the city of Paris organized a meeting to discuss the role of the nightlife and nighttime economies in the city. And in 2014, the Paris Night Council was created to develop and promote nightlife as well. And finally, I will describe the nighttime economies in Japan. So in Japan, this term of the nighttime economy is used either directly as a katakana, which is a phonogram, or in translation. So both forms existed. And a survey of 4 major newspapers, which is Mainichi, Asahi, Yomiuri, and Nikkei, to find out when the wars of these 2 types wars of the nighttime industries, nighttime economies, first appeared in several articles, shows that they were firstly used in July 2013, and especially in the speeches held by the politicians in the Tokyo upper house election. And it was also subsequently published between 2015 and 2017, similarly by the politicians or in the context of the need to expand the content of the inbound tourism campaign as it appears on the right. And according to an interview which I have conducted in March 2020 with a certain experts from the Japan's tourism agency and also the MILT, the expectations of the nighttime economy as an economic promotion measure is in the urban areas, but inbound tourism was put forward as the logic for its implementation of these policies by the government agency that should strive for the public interest of Japan as a whole. And at the same time, the passage of the IR laws, which is the integrated resorts plan, which is based on the casinos plan, and has been also recognized as an important driving force in promoting the nighttime economy. And this, inbound tourism understood as an economic potential has led to the relaxations, deregulations of the legal regulations as well. And specifically, all spaces where guests are allowed to dance have been subject to the entertainment business law, which is known as Fueho since wartime. And on this basis, there was a momentum in the 2010s to amend the law in Osaka and Tokyo due to the increased number of the crackdowns by the National Police Agency in Japan. And in the wake of the Olympic Games, and especially in the context to promote the nighttime industry in terms of appealing the inbound tourists as well, and the national government's growing interest in the nighttime economies, and the collaboration between Tokyo and other cities with a developed nighttime economy such as Berlin, and an amendment to the Entertainment Business Act was passed in 2014 by allowing club operators to operate legally, so to speak. And there have also been a number of social experiments in the late 2010s to revitalizing the night in urban spaces or utilizations of the public spaces during the nighttime as well. In 2015, DJ event was held at the Hotel Hapoen, which is locating in the waterfront area, and it has also a beautiful Japanese garden as well. And in 2015, and also the following year, when Tokyo's Shibuya was produced a night map, the Gyoen night art walk took place, and that was the first time in Tokyo that Ministry of Environment and also the Agency of Cultural Affairs and these 3 departments from the national policies has been collaborated on one specific project under the directions of the Japan's Tourism Agency. And also in Shibuya, which can be introduced that Shibuya is one huge town, but most of those properties are from Tokyo Railway Corporation. And the street event was also held by the same corporation as well in conjunction with the development plan of these real estates. And in this way, cultural and sporting projects, sporting events in public spaces are also gaining momentum with the support of sports and beverage manufacturers. And finally, I will end up with Osaka's case. So Osaka started to invite Olympic Games in 2008. And it also plans to host the World Expo in 2025 as an alternative to the failed bid in 2013. And the city is also looking at the plans to develop the Yumeshima into an oil resort afterwards. So this is Yumeshima. And obviously you can see that this is an island. And MIRT has also conducted the social experiment of extending the service hours of the Mido-Suji underground lines on Friday nights, especially in January 2020. So shortly before the COVID-19, and Osaka was also the city that would like to promote nighttime economies for the 2025 Osaka's Expo. And this is also suggesting that Osaka would have much potentialities to do the pilot city planning in the nearest future. And actually, the certain actors from the MIRT has also mentioned that Osaka and everything, every urban structure is a very small and in comparison to the Tokyo, and also Osaka's, kinds of the regional nature would be more how can I say, the very programmatic. So they could always try to make some innovative urban plannings in general in comparison to Tokyo, because Tokyo is too many actors are engaging, for example, running the nighttime bus for 24 hours, and Inose governor would like to try to make it more permanent services. But unfortunately, that cannot be happen because of the taxi industries that so far existed. So such kind of this, political issues and very naive issues is not so often happens in Osaka, is what I have heard. Okay, and this is a final slide. So in order to stimulate the nighttime economy, it is very essential to improve the means of transport to enable human mobilities during the nighttime. And it is also essential to enhance human cultural creativity, or to have spaces that enable such activities. And for the former, it is necessary to enhance individual mobility, rather than the night being an extension of the day, but a flexible measure such as bicycle leasing, Believe in Paris and also the Lime in Berlin, as in the successful case, those are probably understood as a successful case. And in this respect, cities of the size of the Paris or Osaka may be more suitable, which enable people to move one place to another even during the nighttime. And cities like Berlin, which specialize in weekend tourism, also have a lot of potential. As for the latter, in Tokyo, due to the fragmentations of the land rights and the need to ensure safetyness in the public spaces, cultural events are inevitably limited to privately owned land. So unfortunately, such a kind of the street event, for example, which is including the b-boying, which has been selected as Olympic Games for Paris, and those cultural events are very interesting, but unfortunately in Shibuya, and that was only held in the private properties and not in the public property or public institutions. So, competitions such as skateboarding and breakdancing, which have recently been registered as a game, and also it has been originated in the urban sports, So maybe, in this way, the meaning of the public space will be transformed into a more civic one, a civic engagement, and taking the opportunities for the Olympic Games in Paris and also the Los Angeles as well. And this might be very small, but the conclusions of this presentation, and the reference is here, and the acknowledge is here. So thank you for listening, and I'm happy to have the question and answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Mariko, for this presentation. And perhaps I have a short question. So what is the actual situation of the night economy in Japan with the COVID? Because here in Europe, there is a strong actuality, because I think Florian can say that in Austria, it's all closed. And we learned yesterday in France that the nightclub will need to close now for 1 month. So in Europe, there is a huge danger on what will happen for night economy. But what is the situation after the games in Tokyo, and what happened in Japan in terms of night economy with this situation of COVID pandemic?
Yeah, thank you so much. So the impact will be quite huge, you know, and Japan is not have done a critical measure such as the lockdown of the cities itself. But anyway, you know, alcohol-related industries has been recognized that the kind of the clusters of the COVID-19. And that is also another reason that why music-related industries and music-related spaces in urban spaces has been closed with their own motivations. And the current situation is also very similar, and it depends on the places as well. But the main music venues and music clubs are still closed, and you know, the capacity, how can I say, the size of the music industries of such, you know, the club industries, let's say, are not so much in comparison to the Berlin's, for example. So city will not also, you know, financially support to these industries. So that would be currently the kind of the problem that I would like to provide certain solutions for those actors. But on the contrary, in rural areas, for example, or my city is like Tsukuba, and there is no regulations at all. So the club has still, you know, reopened, and also are in the operations right now. So the different tendencies can be seen.
Yes, it's different from the center, the core center of the metropoles, and what happened outside. And you say finally you made the difference between Paris and Tokyo. I imagine you study the different candidature file of the two cities. What was the difference, the fundamental difference in terms of night economy and the two file of candidature of these two cities? Do you see a very big difference between the approach of Tokyo and the approach of Paris of the night economy, or this is really similar as you wanted perhaps to say with the ranking of cities in the beginning? So the cities are homogeneous in terms of economy now, but in terms of night economy, because in France it's not really a positive image of the night economy, to be honest. So it's hard to, we don't speak a lot of the night economy in the media or in the economy in general. So I wanted to because in Japan it's a kind of the image of the city of Tokyo more particularly. So do you see a difference in the two candidature file and the two way to approach the night economy in Paris and Tokyo?
Thank you so much. So I'm not quite familiar. So I have been to Paris, of course, but I have not intensely done research about the nighttime economies in Paris. So my you know, data and my images is just originated from the previous literatures and previous my very personal opinions. But maybe there is a lot common in Paris and Tokyo that for example, the people of Tokyo are also still, or maybe generally speaking, the Japanese people are saying that nighttime is a very time of the relaxing, time for the families, time for the kind of illegal activities, and time for a darkness and so on. And also the spirituality is also especially the representative time of the night. And so maybe in the very general meaning, I am seeing that the people's in the, you know, for making some policy making in the one specific administrations, and when I have done the interviews, and they have mentioned that a certain, you know, risk is existed, and so that they would like not to, you know, promote, but NIRD, the national agency, is saying that they want to promote, you know, for the nighttime economy. So that what I'm doing currently. But you know, also the Shibuya word, and Shibuya is a kind of very, very difficult to say that the Shibuya is developed, like you know, the current images has been shaped since the first Olympic Games in 2064. And when I have described about the Yoyogi Park, and the Yoyogi Park is quite near from or inside of the Shibuya ward, and you know, the kind of these images relating to the foreign countries in generally speaking, but like a USA, and how foreign countries and foreign cultures and freedoms of expression, freedoms of the cultures have been, you know, influenced certain images to the you know, Shibuya. And I am currently saying that why Harajuku or Shibuya is getting more fashionable town and very famous town in all over the world was that exactly that Shibuya was the place that the USA Army has been used, and there are a lot of the fabrics that has been built up by the USA Army as well during that time. And the Japanese fashion makers and designers in Japanese industries came into those areas since then. And nowadays images has been created during that time. And those people are especially quite happy with the nighttime industries, and they are still understanding that the creativity, to create the creativities, and the nighttime is one of the very important time for them to making some networks within the fashion industries and so on. So it depends on the person, it depends on the cities and municipalities as well, but yeah, that would be my answer to you. And the difference in between Paris and Tokyo, and I was like you, to answer to this, maybe you are much more familiar. But I just think that, you know, what I have introduced during my presentation, and not only Paris, but several cities has actually involving to create the report, for example, and to create the statistic beyond the divisions of the statistic walls, let's say. And those are exactly that I would like to do, or that I have wanted to do for the Olympic Games, because people would like to do that and would like to change, but that could not be made, unfortunately, because the division is still huge. And in terms of this, you know, I think Paris has done a certain effort for doing that, and Berlin as well, to my understanding, or other municipalities and other cities as well. So I think, you know, how can I say, some basic understanding of this nighttime economies would be probably developing more in European countries, maybe. And they are also familiar with the creative industries as well. And Japan is not so good with this criteria so far. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for this answer. And I see the time is running, and we will pass. So thank you, Mariko, Ikeda, for this nice presentation. And I think we will have also a lot of things to speak, because you are working also on indicator and trying to evaluate how the night economy and the games are working. So thank you for your contribution. Now I will let the floor to Florian Purkarthofer from the University of Wien. And you have now the floor, and you have half an hour if you need to speak about your topic. Thank you, Florian, for to be here, and have a good presentation.
Well, I hope you can see my screen, and I hope that you can hear me.
This is working well.
Yes. Okay. Very good. So I would at first I have to say thank you very much for being part of this. I think it's very interesting, and as we've seen the last week, but also in the 3 lectures today, I had the feeling that we are finding some interesting intersections where our topics meet. Nevertheless, let me take you to a little different approach now, because while we had a lot of like international comparison, before, my presentation is very much focusing on Tokyo, not to understand Tokyo, but to understand how the urban game dynamics play out in a single city, and how this is affecting, concerning, involving human beings who live in this city. And I think therefore the games can be seen, or the Olympic Games can be seen as many other events, not as an exception of urban planning as it is done nowadays, or as the struggles of urban planning nowadays, but more or less as just a focus, a lens that makes it possible to look at it even in a better way. So the main question that I would like to raise in this presentation is, whose games are we talking about, and whose city are we talking about? And I think therefore I'm connecting to what Sven talked about before, and also what was discussed by Christian Timmer and Ezra Solomon about who is representing a city, whom, I mean, is an ordinary citizen capable of planning a city? Is the mayor, as an elected person, able to represent all of the city? Or so I think this is a very complicated question that is not only there when we talk about something like planning the mega events or planning the Olympic Games, but it's also something that is there in every planning process that we are interacting with human beings, with the built environment. And the question is often neglected because it raises a lot of other problematic questions, like how is our representational democracy working? Is it still working? Is it working when it comes to urban changes that are maybe very long time or long-term effects? So how can we deal with it? And also, the other question is, cities are big, humans are small. So there is quite a difference between who is the city, or who is representing the city, and who is local, because in a city like Tokyo with a few million inhabitants, and in the greater metropolitan area of Tokyo with about 30 million inhabitants, the question is, can you speak about like the district on the other side of the city? Are you really representing it, or is it more about locality? Do we need to think like, break up this whole idea of a city as a whole and more understand that there are smaller portions and that lives happen on very small scale levels? So who are the locals? And combining all this, I really want to think, or together with you, I would like to, by introducing 3 case studies, I would like to show or try to think through this idea of who is constituting the city, who is living in the city, who is planning, building, representing the city. And most importantly, for our concern with like urban planning, urban futures, urban restructuring, who should be asked about the future city? So is it really a good idea to ask the ones who are living at the site at the moment to ask what it should be in the future, even though we might know that they are not there in the future anymore? Or should we ask the future inhabitants of an area? But how can we find them? How can we address them? And this problem, I'm not the first one, and I'm not the only one talking about this. I get very inspired by this publication I'm holding in the camera now by the Association of City Planners in Tokyo. And it was published in 2015. And it is addressed, it is talking about the Mirai no legacy. So it's the future legacy of the Olympic Games, and it proposes 7 measures that might be taken. But interestingly, it starts with a letter to the governor, because as it says, this is not easily done. Therefore, we need your help. We need your leadership. And I think it's very interesting that city planners publish this instead of sending the letter directly, but it's somehow they are trusting someone, but they might know that it is not the person they want to talk to, because they might try to reach the administration or someone else. So I think it's a silent cry for help from city planners in some way, that they need to publish this pamphlet to somehow get their points to someone who might be in charge. But as this whole pamphlet is like telling us or telling me, it's really made by desperate beings who say, we want to make something good, but we are not in charge, and we are not even more or less invited in the process. So how can we talk about who is invited in the process or who is affected? And therefore I rely on the idea of an anthropocentric local, or to understand locality through affection and the senses. I'm building much upon this idea of combining the ideas of spatial phenomena and affect, so affective societies, together with concepts of Lefebvre and Schmidt and et al. About how human beings are kind of interacting with the built environment around them. But as Mariko said before, it's not so much about architecture or landmark architecture. It's more about how this built environment, how this environment we're living is changing our daily routines, is changing our perception. And it's not so much the outside perception I'm interested in, so the images of commercial travel agencies, but more or less the residents, the people who live there. How are they? What is changing for them? And I've tried to go in this direction a little bit with more or less success. This whole framework or theoretical base is somehow complicated because it tries to combine different ways of social science theory. But what I'm focusing on in this presentation is this round spheres of perception, proximity, and practicality. So I'm interested in this perceiving, what are people perceiving, the sphere of perception, the proximity, so the closeness or topological closeness of objects and human life cycles, and also the practicality. And by practicality, I mean especially the implementation or the impact some measures have on the everyday life, cycle, on daily routines, activities. So how can some venues be used, not be used? What is changing during the games, for example? I also want to give a short note on how I collected my data. I did long-term fieldwork in Tokyo between 2014 and 2016. I was based at the Tokyo Metropolitan University in the city planning department, and were involved in resident participatory workshops for city planning projects. Then 2017, I had my first try with the Olympics in Tokyo in London, and it was very interesting to see how East London was transformed, remodeled during the 2012 Olympic Games. And I think might be a very, very interesting case also to see this connection between the London case and the Paris case, just because it wasn't mentioned so much today. And then I was going back to Tokyo to do another field work. I was supported by the German Institute for Japanese Studies. I'm very thankful for this. And I spent more time trying to talk to citizens, talk to people about what was going on in preparation for the Olympic Games. And there's also this book that came out where I had a small part on architecture in Tokyo and the Olympic Games. So let's jump to the case studies. Let's go into details. I want to present these 3 venues. They are, they are important, or they are, I think we've talked a lot about the Harumi Gochome, or the athletes village, and I will make it very brief here, but I think it's an interesting case anyway. But I want to talk more about the Komosabo Olympic Park and the Equestrian Park, both located in Setagayaku and a part of this like heritage zone. So they were built for the 1964 Olympics, but they were used another time at this Olympics. And they are quite interesting examples of how these venues already have a legacy, already have something like a history in it. And I want to look into this history a little bit to show how the Olympic Games are not inherently bad or good, but it's a lot about how we establish possibilities of usage after the Olympic Games that enable these venues to be spots that people gather, like facilitate, or just empty squares, empty plots. So let's start with the Harumi flag. It is on an island, on a landfilled island, and the first thing I want to point out here is that this Harumi flag, even though it sounds like it is the international name, is not the international name, but it's the brand name of this whole project to sell it at the Japanese real estate market. So there is a whole site promoting this athlete village as an investment, and they use Harumi flag as the code name, as the brand name for this very expensive apartments that were used for the athlete village and are now at the market. And as we see in 2019, the construction is still at work, but it's more or less, it's already there. The buildings, you can see the buildings, they are mostly constructed. Of course, it looks quite different than the architectural rendering that was presented by the real estate promotion agencies that were selling these flats. And I think it's important to talk about the real estate business in Tokyo a little bit here, because the whole village was bought or was paid for by the public, and then it was built by private companies, and then these private companies paid, they bought back the apartments they sold to the city even before the Olympic Games started, but for a sixth of the market value. So there is a really, really big profit in there. So it's like at first they got money to build it, then they got another time they spent, they got another chance to make big money by buying it back from the city for an under market price. And what's also interesting, and just for all of you who saw the presentation of Christian Timmer and Esther Solomon, this is nothing new, but it's not as green and vivid and shiny as it was imagined, or maybe not imagined, but as it was marketed in the beginning. It's quite, well, concretey cold. It's not a surprise. I mean, if you go to other landfilled islands in the Tokyo Bay, they more or less look all the same. They all look like this because it's a very efficient way to stock many flats in there and to have these super block architecture. But of course, I mean, people need to live somewhere, or at least that's one of the arguments. So I don't want to say that everything is bad to construct new apartments, but there might be other possibilities to do it, maybe not in this fashion. I had the possibility to speak to some of my former colleagues from the city planning division, and they voiced some concern. They said, for example, to understand Tokyo's bid for the Olympic Games, the unsuccessful in 2016 and the successful in 2020, means to acknowledge the power of real estate developers, their adjunct construction companies, estate agents, and their practices. It might be sports spectacle or a political show for us, but for them, it's serious big business. So they were very clear and very open about it, that this mega event was needed because there were some investments beforehand. So the government was kind of owing it to the big development companies to do the games. And when you look at who is part of this Harumi Flag investment group, you see like all the usual suspects of the Tokyo and Japan urban developers group. Like down here, you have like Mitsui Fudosan, and you have Sumitomo, and you have Tokyo, the group that Mariko spoke before of Big Four, and you have Daiwa Housing and all of them. And so it's like there is big business is involved. On the other hand, of course, you also have the academic look at this, and there is this word of new build gentrification, and as my former colleague Ralf Lützler stated, real estate market of the surrounding area, that is the islands of Tsutoku, Tsukuba, and Harumi, all part of Chuo Ward, has not been left unaffected by the construction of the Olympic Village and its central location between the two venue zones, and the land prices rose much faster here than in any other area of Tokyo. So not only for them who invested in the Olympic Village, but also for many of investors in the other area, this is like big profit. On the other hand, if we look a little back in the 1980s, 1990, we see that the area of Harumi-go-Chome was already place of sports before. So there were tennis courts, there was a baseball court. So it was used for not professional, but for hobby athletes. And this was all like deconstructed by building the Olympic Village. And before it was an industrial site. So in the 60s, it was an industrial site, and in the 1930s, 1940s, they constructed it by landfilling along with the other islands you see in the city. So to conclude this case study, who are the locals of a former landfill? It's not easy to answer, I guess, because there are no locals there, or if you don't count the fish. So I think that there is the question here is, if you have new buildings on new land, there's always this idea of like talk to the people who, or at least in participatory planning strategies, you say talk to the people who live there. But if no one is living there, what should you do? Should you watch out for the new tenants, or should you look at similar cases? So I think this is one of the questions we really should ask. The other thing is that what is a useful architecture built environment for the locals? Is it the nicely rendered super block design? Where is the human scale in all this? It's very far from the city center, even though it is it's cold in the center, but it's kind of, you're exiled on an island. It is not so easy to leave this island. I mean, if you have a car, it's possible, but if you're like if you're mobile Tokyo style, so you're like with public transport or bicycle, then it's a quite long ride to get from there to anywhere else. It's also, the perception is quite interesting because it's promoted as a big happy shopping mall, but it's very cold, artificial and concrete when you're at space, when you're at the site there. And practicality, well, there is this question of new space for residents is good. New build gentrification might be a more sinister look at it. So let's go on to the Komasawa Olympic Park, which I first visited in 2018, and I was fascinated how empty a place can be. There was nothing there, no one, I mean, it was really, really empty. There was this whole thing was crying emptiness. And I was wondering, so, okay, this is a sad story of an Olympic venue that isn't used. But then I realized I was going there at the wrong time of the day because it's used a lot. It's used by many local residents who take the chance to go there, to make sports, to run, because it's not secluded. So it's in the middle of a residential area, and you can just, like, there are a lot of small entrances. There's no real fence, so you just go in there, you run a little, you do jogging, whatever you like. And I spoke to a few of them. Person said, I run here nearly every day. Another said, we are lucky to have this park here. And an older man said, my dog likes the squirrels. There's a squirrel, Risunoko, and there's a squirrel park. And there are some statues. So I think it's a quite good example that if you give people the chance to use these venues, they might find their approach to it. And if you see how this Komasawa Olympic Park is located, there is a big residential area and there's not so much green about it. So it's really welcomed. And this park is open. You can do whatever you like, more or less. It's not very clearly defined what you can do. At the time of the construction, it was already very populated. And before it was constructed, and I think this is interesting, it was a golf course. So it wasn't open for the public. It was a golf course that was just for club members. So I think it is an example of how these Olympic venues are kind of promoting a neighborhood, giving neighborhood residents a chance to use it, to share it. What might be the problem, I think, or as often is that if planned areas are very detailed, designated for a specific purpose, then it gets very complicated. And therefore, I'm advocating to say we need maybe more white canvas, more plots where the whole discussion about how we use it is happening on site and not beforehand. And we need to have some space and leeway so residents can also change this use of the area. So to conclude this, and then let's go to the last case study, because otherwise I think it will get too long. And this is not very far away. I mean, the equestrian park, you see that in the down right corner, you have also the Komasawa Olympic Park. So this is just a short stroll of maybe 15 minutes away. Interestingly, in 2021, even though there are nice mascots, but everything was closed. There was no possibility to be there. And once again, Christian Dimmer in his presentation made it very clear that what the Olympics looked like from outside was a lot of this white stretchboard wall. But when you've been there before the Olympic Games, it was a very, very nice space, and people like to go there, come here to relax, spend their free time, enjoy the smell of the horses, as one pedestrian puts it, or also because there is a reasonably priced kaiten sushi around the corner, and it's a nice park vicinity, so it's also good for kids. As you see here is an aerial view shot. There are many tanchis around, or there have been many tanchis around, so it was a very welcome spot to go there with kids, to have a possibility, and it looked quite nice. I mean, there are some small yatai shops, and there's place to sit and to stroll, and also the Agrarian University of Tokyo is not very far. And interestingly, so here you have the university, but when you go back in time, you also see that the whole area was farmland before. So this farmland was transformed into stables, into some urban use. And the really sad thing is that the Olympic Games did not like promote this interaction, but they really like installed new gates, new walls, and were like closing people in. So if we ask our questions again, who are the locals? Are these humans or animals? Are these the horses? It's not so clear, but we should think about that maybe we live together in this place or at this place. And well, one of the outcomes still is that there is a longing, or it seems that there is a quite big longing for an interspecies kinship in urban environments, to get more greens, to get more interaction with some kind of easy to approach nature. And this comes together in a very practical idea of small scale for small users, that I would like to call it. So human beings, human-sized parks and so on. What's the problem with all this? Well, small scale and small users means small profits. And as some of my colleagues pointed out in their presentations before, small profits are normally not what wins the bids and not what wins the discussion. So to sum up, we have 3 case studies where we see very different outcomes of how venues are used, of how the Olympic Games as an urban restructuring is changing the practical daily life of human beings in the area. And I think that by looking at these 3 cases, we see that it's not easy to say this is a sustainable idea or it's not, or these games are like they worked, they didn't work. And because it's so local. So one venue might have some kind of working legacy for the neighborhood, and another one won't. And it's not that it works for a whole city or it doesn't. Sometimes it's really small scale, and this is also, to continue the argument of my of the people before, this is one of the points what it makes it so complicated to do research that is kind of capturing the whole argument, because sometimes it's very contradictory. You have like a working venue and a not working venue close together, and it's not so easy to say the Tokyo Games were a success or a failure, because it's ambiguous. To go to a more abstract or meta level, I would like to say, when it comes to proximity, what really was an outcome also of many interviews, I didn't have the time to go into detail here, is that the landmark architecture that is openly discussed, as we heard from, for example, Mariko Tamari's talk, is not really the architecture that city users, residents are affected in daily life. They are really dealing with this default banal architecture. And therefore, for them, even though there's a lot of media consternation about this star architect or that planning or this stadium, the bodily and sensory effect of the everyday architecture is much more important, but much less discussed. When it comes to perception, I would really want to argue that we need more sense-aware planning and participation. We need to go away from just looking at pictures and maps and drawings, but also to think about, we should go there, we should be on site, we should think about what smell and touch and noise is there around, and how this will, how this environment, human, multi-species ecosystem will interact in the future with us. And when we come to practicality, we have an inherent conflict, or at least I see one, between the interests of sustainability and spectacle. Because spectacle, I would say, by definition, could not be sustainable, because then it wouldn't be a spectacle. So I think that there is quite a problem between like mega events that are media focused and time and geographically bound, and long-term ideas about everyday life. And I think there might be a way that is like mediating both amplitudes, but it's not easy, and it's definitely, there is no natural connection between mega events and sustainability. And well, to keep it short here, I just want to say, I think the most important thing is that we might need to rethink the idea of city planning to go from detailed planning to a planning of ambiguity, undecidedness, and to have space that isn't addressed or isn't dedicated to someone special, but it is really up for discussion. And to keep this discussion on site going and to have conflicts there, to have a good way to have this conflict or discussion there, but we might say that the right to the city in the 21st century is a fight to keep these public spaces ambiguous and to have use and misuse of these places, for example, by people who use a jogging strip for skateboarding, or so even though it's not intended, it's their way of space use. And with this, I would like to thank you for listening to my presentation. I hope it somehow contributed to your thoughts, and I would like to hear your questions, and I will try to answer them. And I will like to end my presentation with this picture I found in Tokyo with this nice kind of street art that gives another answer of, well, who is speaking for the city and who should be asked about the future of the city, because Tokyo is yours. Yeah, thank you very much. And there's also my references, a little too much to see here, and also a detailed description of the maps and pictures I used. And if you want to get in contact with me, write me an email, hit me up, or read some of my recent publications. The top one is not available open access now, but it should be in a few weeks. So yeah, and if we want to continue this discussion, I would like to also point your interest to 2 symposia workshops that are happening in the future that might be of interest to you, because I think they deal with also this idea of what it means to be part of, to be a citizen, and also how neighborhood transformation is working in East Asia. So thank you very much, and
thank you for this presentation. It was very interesting. Is there any question? Sven, I see your camera, so I let you talk. And if we have 10 minutes, it's good, because after we start at 1:30. So thank you, Sven.
I'll keep it short, I promise. Florian, I'd like to say thank you for this really nuanced and I think important and really well done research. I really liked your emphasis on ambiguity and on undecidedness and on nuance and this human level and a more than human understanding of cities and spaces. And I thought it was brilliantly presented as well, this argument for kind of slowness, how you were talking about going to these Olympic spaces and it was empty, and your personal affect of this, and then your understanding of temporality, that in different ways and different uses. I enjoyed it very much, and of course I'm going to get in touch because I think these questions are fundamental. I mean, the right to the city and democracy and public spaces and such. I just wanted to ask if you've had the chance to see some of Andrew Smith's work on festivalization and this idea of festivalization of public spaces, because these are sort of similar processes, and I see some sort of dialogue between your work. And I'd also just like to ask what, and this is a very basic and very simple question. You know, it seems to me like you're entering into these big questions, like I said, about right to the city, the FFJ and all this, and you know, processes of democracy and representative democracy, using the mega event as an entry lens into this. So my question is pretty simple. What's next on your radar as a scholar, as a human being? How will you, do you think, and where would you like to go after, say, Tokyo and this? How do you use this understanding to grow somewhere outside maybe of the sort of sub-discipline of mega events? And thanks a lot for your work. I really enjoyed it. It's great stuff.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm very happy that your presentation was before mine, because I think you had, it was very good to have also this this intercity and global comparison, because I think I only present a very local perspective here, and I think that's also one of the downfalls, sadly. So to come back to your question, what is the next step? On the one hand, I think the next step is to see that this is not only happening in Tokyo, and it's not this. What I like to describe, or what I try to describe here, is that what's happening is like what's happening now under global capitalism nearly everywhere, or in many spaces. Of course, you have local confines, you have local rules and all that stuff. But if you look, for example, to Seoul, if you look to other cities, especially in East Asia, but not only, you see very similar dynamics. And I think the next step must be, or should be, to understand how can we bring ambiguity back into planning, because I think this is something that is really not very favored by some stakeholders, because this is like potential risk. And in this time of risk aversion that we are living in, especially fostered through the pandemic, it's even more like we restrict this. We make a new border, a new rule. We say, okay, only here, not there. And I think that it is more like a social process. We need to start here, on the one side academically, on the other side also politically, I think, to understand that ambiguity and undecidedness is very fruitful, because I think it's one of the solutions to this splits in society. When we define everything until the last point, of course we need to disagree. But if it's not necessary, we don't need to disagree. So if we are not saying this is a line for the cyclists and this is one for the people who run, but if we say, okay, this is the street, use it, then there might be conflict, but it's not like we don't need to fight about the line, because we might to get into conflict about one incident, but then we can solve this on side. And I think this might change a little bit of this whole idea that with more rules, with more definitions, we can solve like the world. Like, and I think that this is one of the big problems, and I'm not able to solve it, but I try to make my small contribution to it, to say, we might need to like go in the other direction, not more rules, but less rules, but then we also need some possibilities how to manage or how to mediate conflict. And I think this is, there it gets very hairy, and you have a lot of opposition from especially administrative figures.
Thanks a lot. I'll talk to you soon.
Looking forward to it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Florian. Is there any other question in the public? No, I see no other hand.
I guess everyone is hungry.
Yeah, you are the fourth in the morning. Perhaps it was fourth good talk and long talk. So thank you very much, Florian, for your presentation. And as you say, we will exchange your email, and like that we will have the possibility to continue to work together. I propose we will stop now and we will restart at 1:30 this afternoon with Filippo Binyami and Naomi Hanakata. She's from the University of Singapore, so I think she will be late afternoon. But thank you for everybody, and see you in 1 hour. Thank you, Florian.